Okay, guys, it's gone 9 o'clock. I'll get going. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. For those who haven't been in these spaces before, we run through the news. We use a lot of mainstream sources, but then we heavily add on to that with open source information, a lot of it taken from great accounts here on Twitter. In addition to reviewing the news, we try to present tools and techniques so that whether you're new to OSINT analysis or you've been at it for quite a while, that hopefully we can all bring our skills up together. Also, we try to fairly often have guests on who are doing good work in this space. The idea is that they can present the projects they have ongoing, and hopefully that creates opportunities to collaborate so that we can keep building out the networking in the community. My spaces rely pretty heavily on the use of the nest, which is the area at the top of the spaces window where links to individual tweets can be posted. If you were to scroll all the way to the far right, and I know there's a lot of material up there at the moment, but if you scroll all the way to the far right, the tweet that's there is the invite to tonight's space. But if you were to click through, the thread that follows it contains all of the speaking notes, the agenda for tonight. The reason I do that is I'd like you to have all the sources that I present. That way you're not taking my word for it. You can go and check it yourself. And also that if anything interests you, usually that's a launching point for you to take away further reading. I think that's it. Oh, well, of course, we do like to have community contribution as much as we can get. So if you look ahead in the agenda or anything that we're speaking about piques your interest, you can request the microphone. It's the button in the bottom left-hand corner of the window, and we'll bring you up to speak. And if you're enjoying the conversation as we go along, we would like to get as many people in to participate as possible. So please consider retweeting the space. The button for that's in the bottom right of the window. There's a lot of material to cover tonight, so we'll probably go at a fairly fast clip, but hopefully we will have some great opportunities for discussion from the audience. I'm going to take the first 15, maybe 20 minutes to run through some of the resources and good examples that are more OSINT focused from the last couple of days. Then we'll get into updates. We do not have a special guest tonight, although we will be joined by our friend OPSEC, who has a particular interest in following the developments of Wagner. So hopefully he'll be able to join into the conversation, because that will probably occupy a fair chunk of time tonight. Probably the main update will be with regard to the continuing fallout from the Wagner revolt. But as always, I hope to get into a discussion of the state of the offensive, conversation about both Ukrainian and Russian equipment updates. Occasionally, we don't have time to get into diplomacy and cyber matters and humanitarian questions, but I'm hoping that we get a little bit deeper into those subjects tonight. So I'm going to start at the far right-hand side of the nest, which again, the very first post on the far right-hand side is the invite to the space. The second item from the right is just a reminder that I do hold these conversations every Thursday night at 9 p.m. and every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And our next discussion will be on Sunday, July 2nd at 4 p.m. So the invite is there, so you can set your reminder now. The third item from the right is just a note that, as is often the case, a friend of our space is streaming this conversation to YouTube. I'd encourage you to participate here if you can, because this is the only way that you can actually come up and speak. But if you miss a conversation, you'd like to catch up, or there's some old topic that we discussed you'd like to go back and find, you can have a look on that YouTube channel, as it has most of our conversations. The fourth item from the right is our community calendar that we keep. This is because Space's search is really poor. We have a couple of friends who like to host, whether it be specifically on the Ukraine war or about OSINT-related topics. We use it to coordinate our spaces, but we also put outside events on that calendar. There's a lot that's going on in terms of outside talks. Those are usually from think tanks and universities. If you were to click the link to the web service and open the calendar, each entry generally has either a link to a registration for an upcoming event, or there is often recordings if you go to past events. If you have any items you think would be interesting to the community you'd like to put on the calendar, you can DM them to me, to my co-host Jacoby, or to our friend Planet Baroque, who's down in the audience and does most of the actual work keeping the calendar up to date. But by the way, thanks, Planet. The fifth item, so now we're going to get into the podcasts and events. Actually, sorry, I missed it. In that same tweet that has the calendar within it, there are a couple events coming up. Excuse me, there's one from the ACLED on the use of real-time conflict data in managing crises, which is probably of interest to lots of our listeners. There is a talk being held by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project on corruption's enablers, so how to reveal and rein in professional enablers of corruption, which is scheduled for June the 28th. Actually, so that was yesterday. So hopefully there's a recording of that in our calendar. There is a talk being held by Themis, and it's on the financial crime risk landscape in Russia, which is interesting to me. That's scheduled for July the 6th. And then there is, it's quite a while in advance, but there will be a webinar hosted by Eric Toller of Bellingcat on how to conduct investigations on the Russian internet. And the reason I'm mentioning it so far in advance is because I believe there's a fee for attending that, but it's also limited seating. I think they only allow 25 participants. So if you were interested in that, I'd imagine you'd need to book it soon. Podcasts, there were a lot. I think what happens is that there have generally been more podcasts being introduced just because it takes time to set them up. And then whenever there's a big event like the Wagner Revolt, they all do special editions. So I won't speak to all of them, but I've split them over 2 or 3 of the links in the nest. There were many that relate to Wagner, including by some expert organizations like All Eyes on Wagner. There are also some podcasts in there, things like the Foreign Office podcast hosted by Michael Weiss, who writes for Yahoo News, and others, interviewing the creator of the Vatnik Soup series here on Twitter, Mr. Kallionium. And there was an update on the Greek elections. We discussed that in a space about 2 weeks ago, as that has, the Turkish and Greek elections both had potential impacts for the war in Ukraine. There's the podcast from the Kiev Independent. This particular edition is on Russia's sort of systematic approach to kidnapping Ukrainian children. There were Wagner updates from Deep State Radio, which was actually a new conversation space for me, but they spoke with Jack Margolin, who does great OSINT work here on Twitter and focuses particularly on Wagner. So that should be a great talk. There was a Bellingcat presentation on their efforts to map the cross-border clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan that occurred a little over a month ago. There is a presentation from Anna Mironiuk, who I don't recall if she's the editor or one of the lead investigative reporters at the Kiev Independent. And this was an interesting topic, so I included it. It's why it's essential to do journalistic investigations during war. And so it's, in that context, it was her group that won several journalism prizes for an investigation into alleged abuses in the command of the Foreign Legion, which I think probably many of you read several months ago when it came out. There are also podcasts There's one from it's the Brussels Sprouts podcast put together by the Center for New American Security, and they had on Michael Kaufman and Konrad Muzyka, along with a few other guests, and they're some of the best analysts, Kaufman particularly of the Russian military, Konrad Muzyka of events in Belarus, and they were discussing the trajectory of the Ukrainian offensive. There was a new episode of the Russia Contingency, which is Michael Kaufman, who hosts his own podcast. I believe that's subscriber only on War on the Rocks, but he had on his colleague and a friend of ours, Sam Bendett, who's come to speak with us a few times, discussing drones and the desensitization of death. And it's, that desensitization is an interesting issue. I don't think we've discussed in our space, but that I think deserves lots of attention. And then finally, there was an interesting talk that was held on managing the geopolitical risk of Ukrainian reconstruction. And this is something that's important because if people are going to invest considerable amounts of capital in order to contribute to a speedy Ukrainian reconstruction, they want some certainty or some understanding, at least, of the risks that will exist, as the war hopefully draws to a conclusion, and then following the war, the rapid recovery. And so that was posted by Dmytro Nataluka, who's a Ukrainian MP, and that looks like an interesting topic as well, particularly coming after the close of the Ukraine Recovery Conference that was held in London last week. So lots and lots of podcasts, and believe me, I saw several others that I decided not to include just for the sake of time and space. But there's a lot of good work being done. Okay, so I'm going to mention a couple of resources. So now I'm speaking from the left-hand side of the nest. This is the third and fourth item back. So there were a couple of interesting resources. I will break some of these out individually into the nest so you can see them, because I think they're worth seeing them more readily, hoping you might actually click through to some of them. So I'm just adding them up to the nest now. The first is a new video that was put together by Benjamin Strick, who I believe he's with the Center for Information Resilience, but he also does his own how-to video series on YouTube. His account here on Twitter is Ben Do Brown. So you should see that as the first item in the nest now. And that how-to is on how to use flight radar and satellite images, so that if you see a plane on flight radar or you see a flight track, how can you either try to find it in satellite images, or vice versa? If you see it in the satellite image, how can you go and look on one of the flight tracking apps to determine the information of the flight? And that's pretty handy. I actually encountered this the first time a few weeks ago when Oryx put up sort of this fun, just a picture of a plane in an almost blue sky with just one or two trees in the background. And he said, geolocate this. And some folks actually managed to narrow it down to just one or two flights, which was pretty impressive. There's also the second item back in the nest is an interview that was done with The Economist, where they interviewed the outgoing head of the United Kingdom's Joint Intelligence Committee. And this caught my attention because among the topics they discussed were the role of assessment in the age of OSINT. And they also discussed the use of declassified intel. So when you see the UK Defense Ministry or GCHQ putting out those daily updates, he's talking about the considerations they have in what kind of topics are picked to be discussed publicly, and how the selection impacts sort of the brand image of the Intel shop, which I thought was interesting. The third item back in the nest is a new tool that is apparently coming out from Google I'm not sure what the timing of it is, but apparently it's going to be a new reverse image search function. I know many of us will use apps like TinEye, Google Lens, or sometimes Yandex reverse image search. But having a standalone sort of more powerful tool than what's built into Google Lens will be helpful. And reportedly, it will also give additional context information, such as the date that Google first indexed an image, which should make it much easier to see when old images are being repassed or passed off as new ones. The fourth item back in the nest is a webinar that was held just the other day. It was a conversation between Sentinel Hub, which is one of the major satellite imagery firms, and Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat, and a discussion about how Bellingcat uses tools like Sentinel Hub in their investigations. So that could be helpful if you like doing imagery analysis. There are a few more sort of updates. I'll just mention two of these, and then I'll put one in the nest. So because I am trying to keep people abreast of changes in the community, that includes changes to the accounts of people who are doing great work. So the first is that the account Casus Belli, which works with All Eyes on Wagner and is a friend of ours, he chatted with us during our last session. He's changing his primary account. And so you can click through and see his new account. I believe it's Casus Belli Intel, where the I from Belli and I from Intel, they share the same I. So if you have been previously following him or are interested in the work that he does, follow his new account. The other personnel sort of update is it was announced that the account Cyber Detective, who has highlighted tools consistently for a couple of years now, has announced that they're going to cease doing OSINT tool updates. And the person who runs it also does a tech tip account, and they're going to continue the tech tips, but not the OSINT tools particularly, which is a shame, but everybody, has changes in their priorities. So if Cyber Detective hears this, you do great work, and I appreciated all the tools that you found and shared. One of the most recent things Cyber Detective did a little over a month ago was release a 21-day learning plan to learn Python for use in OSINT. And that's in some of our past materials. So if you search my profile for Python, you should be able to find that. Or if you search, obviously, Cyber Detective's profile, it may even be one of the most prominent tweets. The last item in resources that I wanted to raise, occasionally I like to talk about some of the philosophy of OSINT. So I've just put this up in the front of the nest. It should populate there in a moment. It's a tweet from, just scrolling, Scott Tilley, who does space-related OSINT work. And it's a short thread, really, that's talking about attribution and commercialization in the OSINT space. And it's attribution not just publicly, but privately. And I know that we've had several discussions about ideas around, not to just take other people's tweets and sort of put the content out as your own, that there are plenty of breaking news accounts that do that, and they're sort of, racing for clicks, but that is not analysis. It's not, intelligence development. Scott also talks about the idea of by not racing one another, that allows for better networking and sharing of information so that you can actually develop ideas. And you're not worried about if you present some information that somebody else is going to take it and write about it and, beat you to the punch. And I think that's important. I run a couple of chat groups, for specialized purposes. And it's nice to see that people are now, they'll get information on a story and they'll be asking for references and saying, who should I reach out to in the community to learn more about these subjects? Or they'll be sharing satellite photos and saying, I'm doing some analysis of this. What do you guys think? And so, that community building is important. But then underlying all that as well, Scott talks about the idea of commercialization. And I know that some who are friends of ours have, various programs like Buy Me a Coffee or the new Twitter subscription features. And so I'm not taking a position on this. I just want to raise it for your, to have it on your mind to think about, to the extent that the open source nature of this work, I know it's just the word, but a lot of people have compared it to open source software, given that the idea is to develop a bit of a common resource and share it widely. That when you start to commercialize it, it creates conflicts of interest, and that it may detract from your analytical, your interests may start to go toward earning money or making clicks as opposed to the analysis work that you do. So Scott cautions against that. And I think it's at least worth raising so that if you're somebody who is thinking about going that way, you think about the implications. I know there are some people who will take donations and essentially they act like a not-for-profit using all the funds to do things like purchase satellite imagery or other resources necessary for their work. And so I'm not condemning anything like that. I just want to get the subject out there for discussion. And if anybody has any thoughts on that, you're welcome to chime in with them. But I don't think it's particularly controversial. I have seen some people suggest that just as with the open source software community, the non-commercial side may become increasingly hobbyist, and that there will be a push of the more professional sort toward commercialization in one way or another. And that's probably natural as well. Okay, I'm going to take maybe 3 more minutes. I'm just going to highlight a couple of good examples of OSINT work from the last couple of days. So some examples were raised. Okay, I'll put these up in the nest, if you'll just bear with me. One point that was raised just as a good idea was following the speech that Putin gave in the Kremlin, where he was essentially awarding soldiers and FSB personnel for their efforts to save Moscow, rather cynically, that apparently there were pictures, better quality pictures of some personnel, particularly FSB personnel, who might not have been photographed before. And so Bellingcat was pointing out, oh, this might be great. Pay attention, because if you have a roster of photos for facial recognition software, this is sort of a treasure trove, because it also revealed, unit patches and awards and the like. So those items should be populated into the nest now. The second item back should connect to an article from BBC News that talks about how another of the Chinese spy balloons was recently detected. The reason this caught my attention was because the detection method was done by trawling through a huge cache of imagery using AI. And this follows on our discussion last week with Chris Bollinger and AI tools. By the way, I followed up with Chris to try to get some of those resources on coming up the learning curve together. Because of the Wagner revolt and all the news, several days this week were consumed by that unexpectedly. So I do hope to get some of those materials together and present them in one of our discussions soon. The third item back, so these next two relate to the use of either AI-generated imagery or computer-generated imagery, which is a theme I try to highlight because I think it's an important emerging trend. The third item back is a tweet from Elliot Higgins, and it shows a video that was altered that appears to put a giant billboard up in New York that says no to Zelensky, no to war. But Higgins finds some footage that actually came out just today because the corner was in the news because there was a fire that shows, no, that corner does not have a billboard, and it's CGI, which is, just another in the increasing trend of disinfo using those kind of graphics. The next item in the nest I thought was an interesting reversal of that issue, though. It's a tweet from Nalcio, who's a friend of ours. He works with Oryx and War Spotting in tracking battle losses. And there was a loss of a T-90 tank, one of Russia's most advanced. And apparently, because of the angle of the photograph and the quality of the camera, people were actually arguing that the photo was a render from a video game or some sort of 3D modeling program. And Nalcio went out of his way to find other angles of that same lost T-90, just to say, hey, this is actually a real loss and not a 3D render. And that gives you an example of why use of AI-generated imagery is a problem for intelligence.
Michael, your audio, you want to check it? Sometimes we have little audio glitches that affect Michael's mic, and he'll just be right back.
And actually, I should be back.
Yep.
Thanks for that. Apologies, because I run these spaces on an emulator. Occasionally, a little bug gets into the mic, and I have to reset it. So I had just finished mentioning that AI imagery issue. The fifth item back in the nest, as a good example of OSINT, if you click onto this, it's a thread, follows up a tweet from Intel Crab. It was two different instances of looking at the change in the cooling pond beside the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And they noted that with time, there were two different sort of pond areas that are adjacent to the main pond that had changes in them. And I just like this as an example because it goes to show paying close attention and the fact that there are, little components in those, civil engineering pieces like the cooling pond that may be actually quite important. And by that there are people out there who are paying close enough attention to the satellite imagery to see when a little adjacent pond dries out or when, ductwork suddenly gets exposed in order to try to figure out what the implications are. I'll just add three more examples, then we'll get into the updates. Thanks for bearing with me. So these next two are examples of good work from friends of our space who often come to chat with us. And I like to highlight their work as well. So they should be populated in the nest now. The first is a thread put together by our friend Cameron, and he is going to do a series of threads on the production of artillery ammunition. He has also been writing about overall production capacity, but he wanted to do an explainer about how the shells are produced because it's important to understand all of the suppliers, like the broader set of the military industrial base, everything from powder to the bodies of the shells themselves to the fuses and so on. So keep an eye on Cameron's work. Check out his account. I think he's probably worth a follow. The second item back in the nest is a tweet from our friend Radio and Nukes, who both sort of hunts down radar sources by their emissions in a synthetic aperture radar. And he also will, in satellite imagery, find communications and radar equipment, and then he'll look at how they're used, what their capabilities are. So this particular tweet I thought was interesting because he's using a piece of software that, given the model, and the frequency of a radar system, it will then look at the topographical map around a given point on the Earth to try to project what that radar can see. So that's in his imagery, that's what you can see, are these colored circles on the map. And this type of radar was particularly interesting because it's actually on a mast or an elevated platform that can be lifted and lowered. And that's why there are two different radar sort of line of sight ranges. So I thought that was just a cool use of the analytical tools. And Radio Nukes does work like that a lot. So I'd encourage you to, again, check out his account. The last item from the resources for the week, it's the third item back, tweet by Geo Confirmed. Probably a lot of you saw this, but in connection with the Wagner Revolt, there was some controversy. We discussed concerns about the risk that the Wagner fighters were taking control of military installations in the Rostov region and on the route to Moscow. They were traveling near them. And some pointed out that those included nuclear facilities. I went out of my way to include material on how unlikely it was that they could take control of anything, both from a security measures perspective, but also from how difficult it is to take control of a weapon just from an engineering perspective. So I included those when we discussed it originally. But there were people out there who are well known who made claims, including that Wagner actually got possession of a nuclear weapon. And Geo Confirmed and others went out of their way to say, no, there's absolutely no evidence that that happened. And I know that following this controversy, others have been, either arguing for or against the account that put out that incorrect information. And some people are, saying, oh, they're generally very good, you should follow them. I would be very careful. So I just want to flag that to you. Okay. That's it for updates. Thanks for sticking with me. I like doing that because, OSINT is the way in which we learn about the war in Ukraine and all sorts of other conflicts. And so I know we spend the majority of our time talking about the war, but I do like to look at, the tools and techniques that people are using, because I think it's important for everybody to bring up their skills. And if you haven't tried out some of these approaches to try to do your own analysis, I'd encourage you to take a crack at it. So I'm going to get into updates. I'm going to begin with some of the fallout following the Wagner Revolt. So I'm just going to put this first block of materials up in the nest. And just by way of process, I've been encouraged, because in my agenda, I block top things together by topic. In addition to putting up the individual entries I'm going to talk about now, I think what I'm going to do is try to put up the next block as well, so that you can kind of be looking ahead without having to keep jumping back into the agenda. And we'll see how that goes. If you like how that process works, then please shoot me a message, or in the replies, let me know how you like it. Okay, so what you should see in the nest now is the first item up there is the next block that we're going to talk about. Starting from the second item back, this is an overview of what's happened in the so the second item back. This is an overview of what's happened in the last couple of days. It's an article from Medusa. It's my tweet where I've highlighted some of the interesting new points from this article. And that included claims that apparently what inspired Prigozhin to take this course was the requirement to sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Something I hadn't heard anywhere else is that apparently after that announcement came out, Prigozhin spent several days campaigning, they say furiously making telephone calls in an effort to lobby in order that Wagner be transferred to the control of the National Guard instead, which is interesting because that sounds like he was open to closer ties with the government officially, but that he specifically didn't want to be under the Ministry of Defense, presumably because he viewed Shoigu as an enemy of his, which is consistent with his statements in the last couple of months. There was also a source within the Kremlin who reported to Medusa their opinion that what's likely to happen with Wagner is that they'll become a special combat army reserve. And they base that on the fact that apparently there was another PMC named Reddit that after signing contract with the Ministry of Defense, that's the structural change that was applied to them. So that's interesting insight into what might be coming. There was also a discussion about Wagner's ability to continue operations in Russia, or excuse me, in Africa. And it was noted that Wagner has been dependent on the Russian Ministry of Defense providing them with transport via, airplane, cargo plane. But there's a belief that they may be able to get that similar support from Belarus in terms of planes. However, it was also noted that it will still require Russian permission for Wagner to carry out those activities because the flight path from Belarus to Africa must pass through Russian airspace now because of the closure of EU airspace, which is interesting. And then finally, so again, this is opinion, but it's coming from an interesting source. There were some claims, I believe it may have been an article in the Telegraph that claimed the reason that the drive toward Moscow stopped is because there were threats made to the family of Wagner commanders. But this source is arguing that the police and those sorts of authorities weren't ready. And they say that the fact that the raid on the Wagner command building in St. Petersburg took several hours to be brought together suggests that the security agencies just were too inefficient to have zeroed in on Wagner fighters' family members that quickly. So take that for what you will. Exit, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you very much. That Medusa article, the other really interesting thing that I saw that stood out to me was that they had interviewed a member of Wagner, and he specifically said that not everyone went with Prigozhin and that some units remained in the special military operations zone, somewhere in Luhansk and Donetsk, and others in Krasnodar, which I know one of the questions that a lot of us have been asking is, will this affect operations on the front line for the actual war? And that part was an interesting piece of information to kind of keep in the back of your mind there. He also mentioned that anybody who had stayed kind of near the front lines was so busy every day that it was unlikely they would sign a contract with the MOD anytime soon, which I thought was interesting as well.
Those are great points. Partly that goes to the idea that the full consequences will probably take weeks to months to be known in terms of how personnel are shifted around, and not just in terms of where the Kremlin would like them to be, but also for personnel to have the ability to make up their mind, about whether they'll continue and so on. It'll, for example, it will be interesting what effect they might have on sort of contract length, particularly for the convicts that had been fighting for Wagner. There were reports that the standard 6-month contract often was extended as a means of punishment. So if there were, minor infractions that they were extending convict contract length. With the implication that it was in an abusive way. So it will be interesting to see if the Ministry of Defense, goes back to more the basic contract terms, or has access to sort of the internal records of Wagner to know who is supposed to be on for extra time and the like. The third item back in the nest. So there's an emerging narrative now, mainly I think coming from the United States intelligence agencies to U.S. media, talking about how it may have been that the primary goal of Wagner's revolt was to seize the commanders, whether that be Gerasimov or Defense Minister Shoigu, because they were apparently both in Rostov, the day before the revolt began. Now, the U.S. intelligence community had come out a few days ago and said that they became aware of a likely revolt several days in advance. However, you can see from that third item back in the nest, the tweet by Rob Lee, that now they're tempering it by saying that, well, they had indications there may be a revolt, but that they weren't aware that Rostov, that there was a goal to actually seize Rostov. And the suggestion may be that the goal wasn't to seize the city for the sake of the city, but instead to capture the leaders there, and that the city was just, a means to an end. Which is interesting. But again, I'm not taking it as 100% that the goal was the capture. I would want to hear a little bit more evidence before saying that was definitely the primary goal. The fourth item back in the nest is just so you see that claim I was referring to. It's links to the article from the Wall Street Journal where they claim they were trying to capture those leaders, but that the FSB learned about that plot about 2 days in advance. And so that's why Gerasimov and Shoigu rapidly left Rostov. And after making the announcement that they would be moving toward Rostov, one of the first things that Prigozhin said was something like, Shoigu ran away from Rostov like a little girl. And I thought it was interesting that they highlighted that. And, that might be some evidence supporting the fact that they knew Shoigu's presence there. And that was one of their main goals, was to capture him. Let me just see. I may only have one more update before I go to hands. Okay, so actually, so we'll go to Jacoby because we have a couple more updates in the block. Go ahead, Jacoby.
Yeah, I just found that article, the Wall Street Journal article, pretty interesting. If indeed it's true that the intelligence services in Russia found out, within 48 hours of Prigozhin's move that he was going to do that, when at the same time there's reporting that Western intelligence agencies and the U.S. in particular had known something like this was afoot for at least a few weeks, if not longer than that. And that if this report is true, that, Russian intelligence services were caught flat-footed. And it's, something happening in their country is fairly interesting. Also, I know a lot of little girls who can really run, so I'm not so sure that that's as offensive a comparison as they'd like it to be, but.
Well, I may not have a great grasp on the cultural context, how that would be taken in Russia, but.
Oh, no, I
was
just saying, generally speaking, the girls I know sometimes can run really fast, so.
Well, certainly it seems like Shoigu did. So I'll go to Kitty as co-host and then to exit. Go ahead, Kitty.
Yeah, it seems like Shoigu did. Yeah, apparently, I mean, there are other stories that there are as many as 30 generals within and other officials within the structure who are also aware of it, and some who may be honorary or some kind of members of Wagner, so that it could have been much wider known, and maybe those security forces or some of them also were in on it. So in terms of not being able to get at it fast enough, there was probably a lot of help there.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. That specific 30 number, I'll mention it in a subsequent set of material, but there's a Russian media outlet called the Dossier Center, who they put out a notice on Telegram saying that they had seen documents from Wagner indicating up to 30 generals, or I think it was more than 30 Russian generals, had been made honorary members of Wagner, and that they had the documents to prove it, and they would be putting out further reports on it that would name names. And then just before the space started, apparently CNN, I don't know if they independently got the documents or whether they reached out to Dossier Center and they're cooperating on the report now, but CNN had said they've also seen those documents, which is interesting. I don't believe that Dossier Center has released the full naming of names yet, but I'm going to keep an eye on that. And I will note that just because a senior officer was made an honorary member of Wagner doesn't mean that they were necessarily in their decision-making circle. I mean, it's a nexus of, connection. But, if you think about people who get honorary doctorates or honorary degrees and the like, it doesn't necessarily imply that you're in on planning. Exit, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, mine is just a really quick thought regarding the FSB. Putin's lower level people aren't really known for telling him things he doesn't want to hear. And I wonder how much of the FSB not knowing until 2 days before could have possibly been just a communication issue of some sort, for lack of a better way of describing that. Obviously, we don't know that and might not ever know that. But given how lots of things aren't communicated or don't appear to be communicated, you would think that that played a role in this somehow or another.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Jane, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. If you think about this, I totally agree with you, Exit, absolutely, about the FSB. I think that there were an awful lot of actors here that the honorary Wagner members, that may have been real, or it may have been a way that Prigozhin thought he could empower what he thought he could pull off at the end of the day. But there had to be a considerable, not a considerable, but enough truly important people within the command structure here that were willing to let this happen. Because, he went forward in almost a lightning fast manner. And one would think that this would be almost unimaginable in any other circumstance. But he's always been a relatively, he's a smooth operator, I guess is what I would say. He's always been somebody that's been very tied in and always plays his cards well and keeps them close to his vest. But this was an audacious move. And I cannot believe it wasn't done without a lot of support and the fact that nobody was willing to challenge him. And he got basically no fight back. there were a lot of people standing on the side saying, I don't want to pick a side right now because that could be a really bad decision given the stakes. And I understand that desire for self-preservation, if nothing more, by an awful lot of people up and down the ranks. But yeah, the guys at the top, that group of supposedly 30 generals, wild. And as you know, I think all of us have said here, we still are missing so many pieces of this puzzle that it's going to be very hard to really get a grip on it until some of the bigger, more structural connections start showing themselves. Thanks.
And for those who stood aside, it remains to be seen sort of how deep retaliation will go, whether people will be chosen arbitrarily as examples, whether they'll be investigating down to those who failed to take action. There were also several reports of specific units that were instructed to take action and refused. So we just don't know how deep that's going to go. But we will get into some of the response where we have some clarity in just a moment. So I see, Kitty, your hand up. I think I'm just going to run through 2 or 3 more points from the content, then we'll go to Kitty. So starting from the 5th item back in the nest, these are just more anecdotes that you might want to take away as reading. That 5th item is a tweet from Christo Grozev, who is one of the leaders of Bellingcat. And he notes that they observed panicky midnight communications in Russian intelligence organizations on the night of the 22nd and 23rd. So the suggestion is that that's when they learned of the concrete nature of the plot. And if he can say that they had panicky midnight communication, that might suggest that they have access to the content of that communication. So I would keep an eye on what Bellingcat releases in the next little while, as they may have some interesting insights to communicate. And I mean, if Grozev is willing to come out and say they saw the communication, there's obvious, it's obvious the implication is that they actually have some of it. So I suspect he wouldn't say this if they weren't prepared to follow it up with a demonstration down the road. The 6th item back in the nest is an article from the Moscow Times, speaking with some people who were allegedly, in Russian government buildings that had security services in them, and it's an account of how they were responding in the moment, which is very interesting. There's a discussion in there about how apparently they assembled people together and they said, if you have military experience, we encourage you to, take up arms, we'll arm you, and you may need to go out to fight. Like, they were at that level of consideration, which is pretty interesting. Finally, for this block, I think it's the 7th item back in the nest, tweet from Bellingcat. They have a thread going. I don't think their analysis is complete, but that they're trying to come up with a rough estimate of the cost, the material cost of the revolt. In our last space, I put up estimates of the cost just of the aircraft, whether I'm not sure if it's definitive whether it was 6 or 7 helicopters and the one fixed wing, the IL-22. But the estimate was probably north of $110 million US. But there's lots of video of Russian shelling of civilian areas. There was destroyed equipment on the Wagner side. There was the fire at the oil depot. They, destroyed a number of streets in an effort to dig ditches and so on. So Bellingcat looks like they're working to try to generate an estimate of the total cost, which will be interesting when it comes out. Kitty, did you want to go ahead?
Oh, I was just going to say, I guess it's more anecdotal too, but that the troops in Rostov were reported that they were ready and able and willing to go after Wagner, but nobody gave them any orders. So they just stood by. There
were also claims, the FSB officers had come out and said that they were given orders to attempt to stop the Wagner fighters, but that apparently the orders were too vague or impossible to carry out, and so they claimed that was why they failed to take action. Which is plausible if you're just told stop them, but you're a small detachment or you don't have the equipment to do so. I'm not sure how they expected them to do it. So next I wanted to go into the movements of Prigozhin, just because it's been tracked via flight tracking. So this is tracking of his aircraft. It doesn't necessarily mean that Prigozhin is on these planes, particularly because there were two of them moving. But it suggests to me that it's not a simple case of Prigozhin has been exiled to Belarus, he has gone there, and that's the end of the story. So if you were to look at that first item in the nest, you can follow these. Essentially, what happened was one of Prigozhin's planes initially went from Rostov to St. Petersburg, and then his two planes that were now split between St. Petersburg and the other, which had remained in Rostov, they then separately both went to Minsk in Belarus. However, a few days later, his plane then went back from Minsk to Moscow, and then finally it was tracked flying from Moscow back to St. Petersburg, which is interesting to me. And some people have suggested that Prigozhin is being allowed to travel back and forth between Russia and Belarus to sort of wrap up his affairs, or perhaps there's an acknowledgement that he has business to carry out, and that he may need to be active if the Kremlin wants certain things to be done with regard to how Wagner is wrapped up. Maybe they're permitting him to come to Russia in order to meet with people to accomplish those goals. That's not clear, but it's not just a clear-cut case of he has gone to Belarus and he is now exiled there permanently. So to that end, I've just loaded the next block of content into the nest. And so before I go into that, go ahead, Kitty.
Yeah, wasn't the Moscow stop a meeting with Putin? Am I right?
Well, there's been speculation about that. So again, we're tracking his planes. The assumption is that he has been on most of those flights, but it's not certain. He's also been photographed, and I'll speak to it in just a moment, in a helicopter. So it appears he has different means to travel around.
So I will say something about that helicopter. They showed a close-up of the hand, which wasn't missing a finger, a part of the finger. So that might not have been him in that helicopter.
Okay, well, thanks for that. That's an update I hadn't seen. But to explain
your mic again, you might want to check it.
Sure, just a second.
But that Kitty, that information you just raised, it's yet another reminder to whenever we're evaluating things that we're looking at to be careful, because it can be something other than purporting to be. It's hard to tell.
Yeah, thanks for that. Took a moment to reset. So the first item in the nest is the next block that we're going to talk about, which relates to changes in Belarus, or some of the effects in Belarus. But going back to Prigozhin and his travels, starting with the second item in the nest, that's that claim that Prigozhin is in Russia and that he's in the process of negotiation. And they say that he's just flying back and he's meeting with almost all of his councils of commanders. And Riverside Kitty mentioned that he may have met with Putin. I have heard that. I haven't seen sort of any evidence of that. But unfortunately, with a lot of this, we're going with reports. The third item back in the nest is that photo of somebody who looks quite a lot like Prigozhin in a helicopter. Kitty suggested there may be additional analysis that it may not be Prigozhin because you can't see that the face of the person that would be Prigozhin is obstructed a bit by a pillar, and so they're partly going based on the figure and clothing of the other person getting in the helicopter that looks a fair bit like Prigozhin's bodyguard. But again, that's not 100%. And Kitty, if you happen to know where that analysis was done that suggested it might not be him, if you can bring it forward, that would be great.
Sure, I'll do that. But apparently it was his helicopter, so I'll look for that.
Right. So, I mean, it's, again, what I'm doing here, this is why I present the sources, is I don't want you to take what we're saying as this is a definitive truth. It's that with a lot of these things, we're having to take 2 or 3 data points and saying, do they support one another? Do they correlate with what makes sense? So, I mean, a bit of this is the raw feedstock into analysis rather than the result of analysis. The fourth item back in the nest is just confirmation that Lukashenko had a conversation with Prigozhin after he arrived in Minsk. And there are some funny stories about that conversation, like that tweet from Chris Miller, the fourth item back, where they're quoting Lukashenko as essentially saying that they had a 30-minute, or they had a conversation for the first 30 minutes. It was a very serious conversation. The number of swear words was 10 times higher than that of normal words. And then there was some quote about it was a very masculine conversation. If you have a look at the fifth item back in the nest, there's a quote in there where Lukashenko is talking about his discussion with Putin, where Lukashenko is saying that Putin wanted to whack Prigozhin, but that instead Lukashenko persuaded him to say, look, there's a time to whack and a time to jail. Which I think will be one of the timeless quotes to come out of this whole affair. But let me just see here how many I have left. Just one more point, and then we'll go to hands. So it seems like Prigozhin may be traveling back and forth. He may be negotiating and settling his affairs. He definitely spoke with Lukashenko. As a related note, the sixth item back in the nest, it's not clear what connection it has to Prigozhin, but Putin also met in that same time period with Kadyrov. And I suspect that at a time where Putin is wanting to ensure the loyalty of those around him, and that Kadyrov was going out of his way to, denounce Prigozhin and to put up media of his fighters ready to oppose Wagner, that this was sort of a loyalty check-in would be my guess, but there was no sort of public explanation about what the meeting was about. So we'll go to Exit and then Patrick. Go ahead, Exit.
I just wanted to point out that to the masculine comment and Jacoby's comment earlier, I know lots of women that can swear their pants off far more than some of the men I know, and that amuses the hell out of me.
Okay, I won't ask you to prove it because otherwise we'll be banned from YouTube. Patrick, go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. To Riverside's point, I wouldn't be surprised if Prigozhin is using proxies to negotiate, because a plane crash would solve a lot of problems for Putin just about now. And I wouldn't put it past him for a second. He has a history of it.
Well, that's definitely among the things that we're going to chat about, is this idea that Prigozhin may not have much of a shelf life, and that, will he realize that and try to leave Belarus promptly, potentially to Africa? There's a lot of speculation about that, and it's very hard to make a projection. So I'm almost done putting up this next block, but it's should now be in the nest. And so following, actually, before I get into that, go ahead, Jane.
Sorry, I was just going to mention one thing. I know that OPSEC, I think, made a really good point about the fact, and I agree with him, that I think Prigozhin's safest, most survivable, most viable option is Africa. And how that would look and how that would structurally come together and how he can, disconnect himself from Kremlin resources, that would be a rather messy thing. But I think his lifespan is the longest if he goes to Africa. Not to say that our friend, Mr. Putin of the KGB of old can't reach out and try to have him assassinated, but we will see.
So we'll get to in just a moment the fact that the fate of Wagner operations in Africa is still up in the air, and that it's not necessarily a monolith, in that some operations may persist and others not. And so it may be that Prigozhin is sort of fighting to retain what he can. And so where he ultimately winds up may depend on sort of what assets he can hold on to. Sorry, Exit, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was just going to counter Jane's point with saying that I think we might still be too early to actually predict that. As you just mentioned, Michael, that we're seeing lots of action happen in Africa right now against Wagner, and I don't know that we are really firm on the idea that that is actually the safest place for forces right now, or him. I think there's just too many moving parts to actually evaluate that still.
I don't agree with you, Exit, either. There's just too much. That's just strictly speculation on my part.
Right, but all these measures to sort of hear reports about what's happening in Africa, where are flights going, those points I mentioned about would the Belarusian Air Force allow Wagner to operate cargo flights using their aircraft? That'll be something to watch for. Will Russia permit those overflights of Russian airspace? All of those things will give hints about sort of what the opportunity set for Prigozhin is. Aaron, go ahead.
Hey guys, so there has been talking about this, something about you just put like with the Belarusian Hagen project and Wagner. I talk about Wagner again, even though Prigozhin is in Belarus, Wagner is not. But Russian army units have been reportedly either going in or preparing to go into Belarus, whether that would be in preparation for in case the Ukrainian counteroffensive fails. There's talk about they may launch another front, maybe from Belarus. I don't think so, but either that or are they going after Prigozhin? See, that's the thing. I don't think that they would, they're willing to, take more troops that they could put elsewhere to go right after Prigozhin. But we don't know. That's the thing. Yeah, so that there's some hints there that I've been looking up and getting some insight on as well. But again, we don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah, so we did discuss on Sunday Space briefly that idea of another front opening up. I think it was a former senior officer in the British military who was talking about that in one of the British tabloids. Most analysts I saw who were pretty reliable came out and said that's extremely unlikely. But in a moment, we'll get into a couple of projections about what they may do in Belarus, because there were a couple of theories on that have floated around. Before I go to that, Kitty, go ahead.
Do we know for sure that there is no Wagner in Belarus?
So I think the report Aaron's referring to is that the Belarusian Hagen project had said just the other day that while Prigozhin is there is no Wagner personnel that they've seen. There was a report that came out from Russian sources that they would be establishing a base in Belarus for up to 8,000 personnel. Initially, the Belarusian Hagen Project, who has a big network on the ground, came out and said they've seen no evidence of work toward that kind of a base. But then they came out one day later, just today, saying that they are now starting to see preparation at one of the Belarusian bases. And they give some details on how they think that may go. So I think they seem to be open to, the Belarusian network on the ground seems to be open to the idea that it's in process, but they're not talking about significant numbers of personnel yet. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and just to give a shout out to the Belgian Hagen Project, they're one of some of the best open source intelligence accounts that is in Belarus. That's they're pro Ukraine, and so they've been pretty good in the OSINT community in the past. So they're some of the best assets on the ground there. They do know a lot of people on the ground, and they have connections throughout there. So that's good news. I mean, we take everything with a grain of salt, but we know that they've been pretty trustworthy in the past. Thanks.
Yep. So having an established network like that, which came up, I think, in connection with the disputed elections in Belarus, I believe it was in 2020. It's handy to have fairly reliable eyes on the ground. Whether Wagner builds a base and actually moves that number of people, who knows whether that will wind up being good or bad. But to run through this block of items in the nest, the first, sorry, just doing admin things for a second. The first item up there, among Lukashenko's comments, was the fact that he was okay with Wagner soldiers to come up and to lie low in Belarus. But then he additionally said that his defense minister has actually said to him he would like to see some of the Wagner incorporated into the Belarusian army. Now, I would take Lukashenko's comments, not particularly reliably. Who knows whether they would actually be open to having integration into the Belarusian army. But certainly that's the statement that he made. And I'll get to hands in just a moment, but the second item in the nest is that tweet that we just referred to, Aaron brought up, about the fact that a large military camp is now under works at near the town of Asipovici. And so if you want to see that, they have satellite imagery and so on in that thread. So you can check that out. I see we've been joined by Radio and Nukes. I know he's been looking at this closely.
Yeah, I just wanted to add my 2 cents about that site. I've ordered some sat images. I've got a pipeline built for it as soon as it's not cloudy there. But I've looked at a lot of sites, and I have not seen a site like that had that much stuff in the archive. So that means people are watching that site closely. I mean, it had every pass of the ultra high resolution images had something in the Skywatch archive, which means somebody's tasked the satellite to that site for at least a month and a half. So for what it's worth, people are watching the site. That's all I got. Back to you.
Interesting. And we'll be excited to see what work you do with the imagery you can get there. Radio and Nukes, in chatting earlier, had also suggested to the Belarusian Hagen Project that if they're putting out satellite imagery in order to help the community so that others can sort of rapidly know where it is, if they also wanted to get imagery to see later developments, to include the lat and longitude or longitude details, because if it's just an image of a field and they tell you it's near this town, it can take a while to actually identify the specific spot, so you can get your own images. So that was a helpful thought from Radio and Nukes that hopefully a couple of people pick up on. So the third item back in the nest, it were continued comments from Lukashenko. This is the tweet from Medusa, their article, where apparently he also said that Russia has now deployed a significant part of the nuclear weapons that it plans to move to Belarus. But he went on to note that Wagner will not guard any of those nuclear weapons. So it was interesting that he brought them up in that context. Since we're on the topic of nuclear weapons in Belarus, it had been a bit of an OSINT mystery for a month or two where the storage facility would be. I think others were actually looking at a different location. But if you have a look at the fourth item back in the nest, Konrad Muzica notes the specific place near Vitebsk, or excuse me, near Prudok, which is in Vitebsk Oblast in Belarus, that it already has a missile and air storage base, and that there's work ongoing there. So I know several accounts have gotten satellite imagery for that. We're joined by a new speaker, John. John, go ahead.
I was just curious, as far as doing some OSINT on Belarus, is Telegram a good resource for info on that, or the Russians and Ukrainians are heavy on there? But just in terms for the Belarusians, I'm interested.
Well, from my perspective, I think that Telegram is the best source both for Russian and Belarusian information. I know if we had a game to take a drink every time we said Belarusian Hagen Project, we'd be racking it up now. But they have an account on Telegram. There was actually an article in The Atlantic that said Telegram is now the most important app of this war. So I would suggest that if you're wanting to follow events, you probably do need an account to be that much closer to the news. We've talked about the way that there's a delay in the news filtering to local reports. Then they wind up on Telegram. Then Telegram gets slowly permeated to Twitter, and then often there's up to several days delay in the information cycle to what we see here in English on Twitter. And so if you want to be a little bit ahead of that curve, cut it down from a couple of days to maybe a couple of hours or a day, you probably need to be following the accounts on Telegram and be open to just translating a lot of the material.
Do you have any recommendations for some good channels on Telegram?
So I have a bunch that I follow. Many of the ones that I follow on Telegram are more of the official ones. There are friends of ours who were earlier to the Telegram game than I was, and that some of the most interesting accounts were made private or locked very early in the war because they only wanted to let trusted sources in. And so there are people among us who were into a bunch of those early on and sort of remain able to view it. A lot of the ones I follow are like the main government accounts, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian various defense ministries, different defense districts, and some of the big Russian mill bloggers. As to who to follow with regard to Belarus specifically, I'm not sure. But if anybody listening is really engaged in this game, I know that we have some of the equipment loss trackers among us who I think are heavily engaged on Telegram. If you guys have any suggestions about what accounts to follow and you want to put together a post and let me know, then I'll highlight it in a future space. But I'm sorry, I can't be too much more specific than that at the moment, John. If you do a quick search on Twitter for, Telegram accounts, OSINT, there may be existing lists, but I can't attest to how reliable they are. Kitty, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say a word of caution because there are also a lot of propaganda channels on Telegram. So yeah, that's a really great idea to put together some accounts that people can trust.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. To the extent that we can but even any list that is put together by us would rely heavily on pro-Russian sources on Telegram. And therefore, you probably can't take what they say at face value either. As I said, a lot of this is feedstock into the analytical process rather than analysis itself. And by going closer to the source, you kind of get even that much more noise. I think it was Exit and then All Source. Go ahead, Exit.
I was just going to put a quick note for OSINT-Ukraine.com, which is a friend of the space, Ben B., and he aggregates a whole bunch of Telegram channels there and other news channels and other things there as well. So if you don't have a Telegram account or you're just kind of looking for a one-stop shop, he's done a lot of that footwork for you already, and that would be a good place to start.
Right, and so he collects both Russian language and Ukrainian language, and then sort of bulk translates them to English from a whole bunch of accounts. So that's a good point. If somebody actually has a link or a tweet, I know I've done one on his tool in the past. If you put it up in the nest, I'd appreciate it. All source, go ahead.
Yeah, so John, just to your point, there's a lot of accounts that aggregate all types of news information, either Telegram and news, and I think there would be a universal agreement that the beast of the beast of that type of information, if you don't want to go through millions of different Telegram channels and translates, the one you want to follow is Feituk News. I mean, he's a beast. I mean, just straight up, that's the guy you want to follow. If you want a kind of like a complete aggregator of information from Telegram, news organization, whatever, Feituk's News. I think he also collaborates with BNO Newsroom. And so he does great work, and I would highly recommend, because tracking Telegram, the issue you're going to run into, John, I mean, and this is something I run into, is that there gets to a point that there's so many that it's extremely difficult to try to track everything, and especially if they're foreign language, and that you don't speak that language, then you're at a severe disadvantage of trying to track the information accurately. And that's why these OSINT aggregator accounts provide phenomenal work and do it. But Feituk's News, and there's a bunch of others that are friends of this space that you can use.
Hey, I appreciate it. Can you spell that out?
Yeah, I'll share a tweet of his just like right now, and just in the nest, and then you guys can use that as a reference to follow.
I think Jacoby has one in the nest and also one from Ben B.
Yep, you beat me to it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. So the last point in this block is something we've already discussed. I'm not sure. My nest may be updating a little bit slowly, so I may not get the number right. But if you look back, I think it's maybe the 5th or 6th back. It's a tweet from Oliver Carroll. Oliver Carroll writes Defense Matters for The Economist magazine, and he reached out to a Ukrainian intelligence source that he knows, and he asked whether there was evidence of Wagner camps in Belarus yet. He said they haven't seen any, that partly this talk of this number, 8,000 personnel, might be a game to get Ukraine to move some forces toward the northern border. But he also, apparently the source also went on to say, they believe that an invasion from Belarus is very unlikely. However, that the Wagner guys could be used for propaganda or for training. And that's an interesting thought, to the extent that Russia has had, I think, toward 10,000 personnel in Belarus at a time. And the theory was that a lot of those were people there were in training. Having Wagner forces be among the more tactically sound and experienced, using them for training for a time might free up other forces or be higher quality trainers. So that's one theory I've heard that actually sounds, plausible to me. Okay, I'm going to put the next block up in the nest. And so this is quick. This is just with regard to basically the seizure of heavy arms from Wagner, and the fact that the Rosgvardia, who is like the sort of National Guard police service, is also reportedly supposed to get heavy weaponry. Now, again, these are reports of what is supposed to happen. I'm not aware that there are good accounts on the ground of equipment actually being seized from Wagner. But so you'll see the first item back is a tweet from Medusa about the fact that, or actually they may have populated a little bit slowly, but the first tweet that will populate in a moment is about the seizure. Yeah, there it is, from Yaroslav Trofimov about the fact that the Russian MOD says they will seize the heavy equipment. The second item back in the nest is from Medusa saying that Rosgvardia will get heavy equipment. I doubt it's as simple as the fact that the Wagner equipment transfers from Wagner to Rosgvardia. I suppose most of the heavy equipment of Wagner is near the front, and that Rosgvardia, because they're in the rear, will get the old equipment that is less needed at the front. But I guess you never know. And then the third item back in the nest was just the fact that the head of the Rosgvardia came out after Putin made that speech at the Kremlin about congratulations on saving Moscow. Came out essentially saying that all the Rosgvardia personnel stood to the death, and they definitely would have defeated Wagner. But that was contradicted by, in this thread, a bunch of people putting up pictures of reportedly Rosgvardia troops literally standing while the Wagner column is driving past. Colby, go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. I just wanted to say that the fact that the Russian National Guard is supposed to be receiving heavy weaponry now, which is something that they never had before. I suppose it remains to be seen exactly what they'll get, but there seems to be some discussion of tanks, and that says to me that there is a ongoing belief that the threat, either from Wagner or from regular army units staging some other mutiny action against the state, is definitely a real scenario that they're concerned about. Because to your point, even if they give the National Guard units sort of the bottom of the barrel in terms of whatever heavy equipment they can scrounge up, Russia's in a pretty tight spot and can't afford to really have too much unavailable for the units that are actually on the line. So the fact that they're willing to allocate heavy equipment of any sort to the National Guard, which is an internal security force, that says to me that they are definitely still concerned that there are ongoing threats to the state from heavily armed groups, not just people, domestic unrest among the populace, but actual organized armed units like Wagner or army units. They're concerned about that. If they weren't, then they wouldn't take this step.
Thanks for that, Colby. I didn't see the order, but I think it was Patrick, Aaron, and then Radio and Nukes. So go ahead, Patrick.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'll echo the fact that this is very interesting that we're seeing the Rosgvardia start to see or apparently begin to get heavy equipment. I think that is a short-term measure. And the reason I say that is, as you've been discussing, we did see Rosgvardia units basically stand down and say, I'm not getting involved. I'm not getting in the middle of this. I don't know how this is going to turn out. I don't want to be on the wrong side of it. Putin needs reliable combat power around him at all times. And I think, I'm not sure who mentioned it, that the anticipation is that this issue could come up again. I think that's right. In the long term, he's going to need something better than National Guard. I would point out that the FSO, the Federal Protective Service, is close to 50,000 uniformed personnel plus several thousand plainclothes, and they are the official bodyguard of the Russian president. We may see that organization turned into more of a actual militarized unit with heavy weapons. We may see the reconstitution of what are termed, whatever portions of them are still surviving, reliable units from either the VDV or the Spetsnaz. I don't think the Rosgvardia is going to be the first line for Putin's bid to retain power, simply because they are at their core, they are unreliable. So going forward, I think this is a stopgap. This is a short-term measure to deter anyone who might be having similar thoughts, who thinks this is a moment of weakness. But I would expect to see some type of new internal security apparatus emerge from this.
It'll be interesting. Hopefully, there will be some enterprising OSINT folks who, I wouldn't put it past the Rosgvardia to go out and have a press conference to show off their new equipment, to demonstrate how they're keeping, Moscow safe. But short of that, hopefully we do get some reports from some other means on how they're equipped. Aaron, and then Radio and Nukes. Go ahead.
Just to piggyback off of what Patrick said, yes. I mean, the Rosgvardia are not that well trained. In comparison to Wagner, Wagner would have kicked the crap out of them probably. They're not that well trained. And now that if they're getting T-72B3s, or if they're getting, other heavy armor, BMPs, do they know how to use it? Probably not very well. And they're getting a crash course on it, maybe, but they're not going to be effective. They're not going to be effective against properly trained forces, and certainly against Wagner, which are seasoned fighting veterans, they're not going to do that well. I mean, if they weren't going to do that well, and they probably won't do that well against more Ukrainian forces as well.
Thanks, Aaron. Go ahead, Radio and Nukes.
Okay, I'm slight pivot here, but I agree wholeheartedly on the Rosgvardia. Their performance so far has not been wonderful. But my question is, in all of this, looking at some historical coup attempts and things, it feels like Prigozhin has either a get-out-of-jail-free card, or he's holding something, or he's got enough power that he's not being touched. Because, I mean, that plane would be super easy if he was on it to shoot down for them. It's flying over some of the densest air defense concentrations, ground-based air defense concentrations in the world right now. Its flight path. So, does anybody know? I mean, the standard playbook of Russia has been, you get rid of the opposition immediately. And this deal, to me, just seems strange. And I don't know, I guess that's where I'm at with it. I was kind of out of pocket for some of this, but it just feels off. And I don't know what it might be, but I feel like there's some kind of, he's got either power or something that's keeping him above ground, for lack of a better word.
And I think there's been lots of similar speculation from lots of different directions. In just a moment, I think the upcoming block includes some analysis, including some Russian political analysis, and that it speaks to your concerns as well. I saw Patrick's hand go up. He may be in response to Radio and Nukes, so we'll go to Patrick and then to Exit.
Thanks, Michael. I'll be brief. Radio, I have been having the same thoughts for about the past 5-6 days now. I'll offer you this, and maybe this sounds good to you, maybe it doesn't. From Putin's point of view, he can't afford to take out Prigozhin before he has Wagner under control, which means whoever didn't participate in the mutiny, you get folded into the regular military, if indeed that is the deal. The ones who did, we shuffle them off to Belarus. And whatever controls he's going to put in place there, and there will be some, he's got to have time for that. And then you kill Prigozhin when you can. And I would expect them to make it look like an accident, or at least plausibly, superficially an accident. But for the moment, you can't afford for Wagner to get testy because you just whacked their leader again. Or you whack their leader, they get testy again, they do another revolt. Maybe this time all of Wagner joins in. He can't afford that. He's got to, at least in the short term, put those people under positive control and make sure that they can't rebel again before he moves against Prigozhin himself, because there's still some loyalty there.
Well, and you might say, why would Prigozhin go along with that? And given he's reached this point, he may know that that kind of usefulness is among a very few reasons why he remains alive. And so he may not be opposed to, going along for now, hoping he can figure it out before the hammer falls,
Oh, I agree, Michael. And he'll probably try to slow walk this whole process for exactly that reason.
Mm-hmm. Exit. Go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on one small piece of that Rascavardia picture and post. He makes a point of saying that I will say the guys handed over their cash to their wives and immediately regretted it, as if like they wouldn't have given their cash to their wives if they didn't think they were going to survive. And that's not the first Russian forces member that we saw write that as like proof that they were willing to die for the cause. And we might become big in Russia because there's going to be a whole bunch of Russian wives now looking for information about how to look up the bank accounts that seem to be hidden for all of these Russian forces guys now. So, Mr. Bond, you might be popular.
That's a niche area of OSINT. Maybe we should get our friends who do the crypto tracking. They can offer their services. But I mean, who among us hasn't gotten so scared that they've given up their cash slush fund to their wife? Okay, next block of updates. Starting with the first item in the nest, just want to point out that when Putin came out, so Putin's made several speeches. You know, he made the initial Prigozhin is a traitor speech. Then his press secretary said everybody's pardoned. Then Putin came out with a second speech saying Prigozhin is a traitor again. Then he had a meeting with his National Security Council, and then he came out and said, yeah, just kidding. We actually funded Wagner this whole time. Here's how much we spent on them. All those times we denied it in the past were lies. In that particular speech, he also made reference to hoping that they stole less than the amount that they were paid, which a lot of people are taking as implication that Russia has learned some lessons from the West and will try to bring them down by investigations for fraud, tax evasion, that kind of a thing. To the extent that Patrick was talking about Prigozhin being necessary to keep the organization together, you see how Russia is persecuting its political opposition, Navalny, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin. So I actually wonder if maybe our pessimism is too overstated and that they'll just throw him in jail, you know, and essentially make it out to he was a robber baron. And so, you know, he stole from the state, I think is another way it could go, which isn't getting a lot of airplay at the moment. The second item back in the nest was a statement that just came out today where the head of the Duma military committee, armed services committee, Kartapolov, came out and said that Prigozhin has still refused to have Wagner sign any contracts with the Ministry of Defense, which some are claiming is what kicked this whole issue off, and that therefore Wagner would not continue to have a role to play in the fighting in Ukraine. That's a standalone data point. I don't know how that will play out, but that was the development this morning. However, it seems like they want to keep Wagner operating. So the third item back in the nest, there were reports of Wagner recruiting centers reopening in many places. There was a video of Wagner recruiting billboards being taken down in many places. But the fact that the recruiting centers are reopening is interesting. Related to that, the fourth item back in the nest was work by some independent journalists who called up the Telegram reporting numbers to walk through an interview about we'd like to join, we have doubts, they're being called traitors, where's the training taking place. So if you're interested in those details, you can watch that video. But essentially they basically say you can't trust what you see on the TV. There's more going on than is being made public. We're still operating. Send us your info. We'd still like you to join. So they appear to be continuing to run. Okay. If you'll just bear with me, I'll get the next set of materials up. This relates to Russian command staff. Maybe one of my co-hosts can just do a quick admin update while I get this ready.
Yeah. Guys, if you
Sure.
go ahead.
If no, go ahead. Go for it. Okay. Sorry about
this is
that.
very
Mic
awkward, guys.
confusion.
All right, let's tell a joke.
Yes. Sorry. I think our microphones are
So all source and spook. All source and spook walking over.
I think tongue-tied.
Okay, sounds like the airlines are clear now. I'll try and give my co-hosts a bit more of a heads up next time when I am going to disappear to do that admin stuff in the background. If it may be lagging a little bit due to content in the nest, so hopefully we'll clear that out and that won't be an issue. So this next section is on command staff. The first item back in the nest is just the fact that Shoigu continues to be on the job. He was at the meeting of the security advisors to Putin. Later in that day, he met with military leaders from Cuba. So we've now seen at least 2 or 3 videos of Shoigu continuing on the job, because there was for about 2 days there was a Shoigu watch saying, where is he? But it seems like he's not going anywhere yet. The second item back in the nest, though, is a claim from an independent Russian media outlet that there is a corruption scandal that has now stuck to one of Shoigu's deputies. And so people were looking at this and saying, oh, well, maybe they're trying to find angles so that if allegations against this deputy stick, maybe they'll try and flip the deputy, so that Shoigu's in a precarious position and they have, pretext to remove him. But it's not clear that it will go any further than that. So apparently it's just an investigation of his deputy so far. The third item back in the nest is just reference to the fact that Wagner friendly Telegram channels had started to float in those first days after the revolt the idea that the governor of Tula Oblast, whose name is Duman, might be a candidate to replace Shoigu. We discussed this briefly in our last space. Once again, I don't think many of us know all that much about Duman, but in case there are some among us who are looking closely at Russian, personnel and backgrounds, have a look at Duman. The fact that Wagner-related accounts came out and mentioned him, but Shoigu's not being removed, in a way, it may actually be a kiss of death, suggesting that if he was their favorite candidate and the switch didn't happen, he may now have no chance at it, because he will be painted as having been their choice. The fourth item back in the nest, it's a couple of days old. The only reason I'm including this, because it's a recommendation coming from Rybar, which is one of the biggest Russian military bloggers, who is sometimes right, sometimes not right. I don't normally rely on him, but he was retweeted by Rob Lee, who's pretty reliable, and he at least found this interesting. And that was the suggestion that if there were to be a reshuffle in the Russian Ministry of Defense, instead of it being Shoigu and Gerasimov who are moved, it would be sort of the next level down of commanders. So those in the main operation directorate, the main combat training directorate, and the organizational and mobilization directorate. Now, I don't have much insight into why people at that level would be targeted. Whether it's because the Kremlin is concerned that, operations, combat, and mobilization failed to act to oppose the Wagner revolt, or whether there are specific political reasons. I don't have insight into that, but I see Patrick has put his hand up, so he may.
Michael, this is what I'm hearing, and I must stress it's unconfirmed. The thinking behind that is Shoigu is too politically powerful. He knows where too many bodies are buried. You can't get rid of him. Gerasimov is his guy. You can't get rid of Gerasimov. So if you want to placate Wagner, then you go for these next tier guys that are more politically expendable, albeit there will probably be more of them removed from their posts, and that will cause greater command confusion, but it preserves the political hierarchy. Otherwise, you may end up with an internecine squabble where Shoigu and Gerasimov start talking out of school.
So, Michael, if I can respond to that for a second.
Yeah, of course.
Patrick, with that, the problem we're seeing is, like, and the major figure that has been detained right now, or whatever the term they want to use, is Sorokin, who was from all reporting we're getting, like, he was very close to Wagner and Prigozhin. Like, it was Sorokin, Prigozhin versus Shoigu, Gerasimov. And what it looks like is Putin is now directing the Prigozhin camp to, pound sand. And the irony, probably, of all this is that if you analyze this war, Prigozhin and Sorokin were probably the only ones who managed to achieve results in different ways. Sorokin, for the most part, was successful in pulling out Russian forces out of Kherson. I mean, I don't think anybody here is going to argue that the Russian withdrawal from Kherson was a failure. And I think the Ukrainians didn't want to fight for Kherson if they could just force the Russians out. And then Prigozhin, and I use success in quotes, obviously. I mean, he seized Bakhmut but clearly it was extremely bloody and non-attainable, but at least he seized it. Like, he demonstrated to the world, like, hey, Wagner will fight, no matter everything be damned, compared to what we've seen with the Russian army. So it's almost as if Shoigu and Gerasimov came on top, but I think the reason why Shoigu and Gerasimov are in power is not necessarily because they have a very powerful political base. I think it's because they're generally Putin's guys.
They
Putin,
are.
Yeah.
And you don't want to remove them if you don't have to. I'm saying if you feel you're forced to in the short term to placate Wagner, you still can't. And maybe this is a sop to get them off your back. But I agree. I think whatever deal Prigozhin cut, Suvorikhin was not part of it.
Yeah, I mean, who have they captured? I mean, who have they removed? I mean, I know there's a couple reporting and I think there's been some reporting out there on the open source, but from the most part, what I'm looking at, like, it was Sorokin's deputy, I believe. I saw that he was fired from there's been reporting unconfirmed, obviously, that I think he was completely removed from the Russian military, not just fired from his position, like, out of the military. And it was Sorokin's deputy. Like, I've not seen anybody Shoigu Gerasimov camp that's under threat right now, unless maybe I'm mistaken.
No, I haven't seen it. What the rumors we have gotten are largely unconfirmed. Even the deputy thing, I don't know if we can call that fact yet. But yeah, to your point, it doesn't look like Putin's willing to play ball on that point of the deal, if indeed that was part of the deal, which obviously even that's a gray area still.
And we're going to speak to sources for some of the things that Patrick and Allsource just raised in a moment. OPSEC, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and so everything that they were saying, I think, actually falls in line with this narrative that we've seen emerge and goes and, predates the full-scale invasion all the way back to 2017, 2018, probably prior to that, where sort of this MOD leadership outside the GRU has not had a lot of patience for Prigozhin, but we do know that, people within the rank and file sort of admire Wagner. And I think that's something that has come more so after the full-scale invasion. And it wouldn't surprise me if there were people within middle management, but for the most part, Slivoviki have not been huge fans of Prigozhin, and a lot of the people in leadership within the MOD have been wary, to say the least, because his activities have been taking away funding from their interests.
Yeah, that's all very interesting, and we'll get into a little bit of the motivation and the opportunities for the broader organization in just a moment. But it was good timing for that exchange between Allsource and Patrick, because I just wanted to update on the claims regarding Surovikin. So if you have a look at the nest, the first item is a link to the New York Times article where the U.S. intelligence community made claims that Surovikin had knowledge of the revolt before it occurred. And I know that there's been speculation about the motivation for the U.S. to comment here. I think Patrick's written on it and others suggesting that whether true or not, it's probably a good play for them to be putting, the cat among the, what's the phrase, the cat among the hens or something. So you can read that New York Times article there. I think it's a gift link. The second item back in the nest was referred to already. That's the claim from the Dossier Center that more than 30 Russian generals may be honorary members of Wagner. Once again, this I don't think the Dossier Center has put out their full report, which names names yet. And CNN and just this afternoon picked this up and was reporting on it as well. So it's not just a Telegram post. But I'll break for a moment. David, thanks for joining us. Go ahead.
Hey, I've been lurking here for a while, and I run a museum, so I deal with World War II history a lot, World War I history, and I've been studying this, and it is, and I'm not one of those guys that says Putin's Hitler or anything like that, but so many of the things that he's doing, bringing in paratroopers with no experience or anything, and making a lot more new units instead of fitting out the ones those are typical things that Germany did. One of the things that is a parallel, it doesn't matter how badly Goering messed up, or Goebbels, or anybody else of the top tier leadership under Hitler during World War II. It doesn't matter how bad that it got until you were actually caught in the coup. Rommel, you were never disciplined. They would never discipline the top leaders, no matter what, going forward. It was always the mid-level, like divisional commanders, things like that. They were always replaced or accidentally shot or fell off bridges, whatever. And that continued right till the very end. Nobody was held, nobody at the top could possibly be held responsible because they were Hitler's favorite. And I think that there's a parallel here. We probably won't see the top tier removed until the war's over, or until they really screw up. They're there. They're going to be there. They have Putin's ear, and Putin is probably, a couple steps removed from the war, and he's probably believing a lot of these numbers and being very insulated, and he's not going to remove anybody that keeps saying things that he wants to say or wants to hear. Sorry.
Yep, the historical examples are interesting to consider. We'll just have to see if these cases break with that precedent or not, which is the question of the hour. Well, I'll go to Jacoby as co-host and then to Aaron.
Thank you. My curiosity is about the idea or the suggestion that there are honorary members of Wagner. I'm curious about what that means. Like, is that, a lapel pin, or is it, secret, or is it, intentional liaison between the PMC and the Russian military, or is that entirely speculation in all regards?
That's a great question. I had assumed it was sort of like, there are reserve regiments and things around me who will have honorary members who are sort of like patrons and, people who have contributed in other ways over the years. And I assumed it was a role like that. But again, that's an assumption. So anybody who knows would love to hear from. We'll go through Aaron and then Jane. Aaron, go ahead.
So this is the release. What I put in the nest there is actually from So the Wagner, this is from BBC. It's a map of all the recruiting centers, at least publicly known. So the Wagner private military company, they're still recruiting fighters across Russia for the war in Ukraine. And this is actually a map of those recruiting centers, according to BBC. Everyone who answered confirmed that everything was working. So, I mean, this is what we're looking at here. I mean, this is how deep Wagner is within, the Russian MOD, the Russian government, and this is, of course, how many recruiting centers they've got. I mean, and and like David, I'm a military historian. I'm building a military museum, and so I make the same kind of comparisons to the Second World War, even First World War in some cases.
Thanks, Aaron. Go ahead, Jane. Jane, if you're with us, you may be on mute. Okay, we'll come back to Jane in a minute. I'll just keep running through some updates. Hopefully, if I was bumping into Jane, somebody let me know, but otherwise I'll keep going with updates. So the the third, I think we were on the third item back in the nest. So this was what AllSource was referring to. This is the claim that Surovkin's deputy Yudin has been fired from the Russian army. However, this claim, it comes from a Russian journalist by the name of Alexei Venediktov, who's described as well-connected. So, I am not deeply into, Kremlinology. And so I have to take for granted the fact that the Economist journalist says this Russian journalist is in a position to know. So that's, again, whether you take that as valuable or not is up to you. I think that may have been it for the block. Jacoby, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you want to come in with something?
I just wanted to note OPSEC's hand went up in there somewhere, and he might have been able to come in on something there.
Well, OPSEC's always welcome.
Yes. So I guess to the honorary title portion or question that was asked, I think it's all about signaling. It doesn't really do anything, but it's something that Prigozhin can use to sort of bolster his efforts. And I think it's also important to remember that that's not uncommon in, even within the Russian MOD. For example, the unit or brigade that was involved in Bucha also received, an honorary title from the Kremlin. So it's about signaling internally, I think, more than anything else. And because Prigozhin had those problems within the MOD that I was talking about earlier, I think that is important to him to, have these titles out there and have members who are well regarded within the MOD accept them. And I think it's also important to remember that with Sorokin, he had this experience with him in Syria. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's one of the few generals who has sort of tacitly endorsed Wagner more than we've seen from the rest of the MOD.
Thanks for that. And we're going to get round to Wagner operations in Africa in just a moment. So hopefully we'll get tons of insight from OPSEC then. I know there are hands up. Just in one moment, I want to point out the last two items in this block. So they're the first two items in the nest now. I just want to highlight that it's unclear exactly what Surovkin's status is, in that the Moscow Times came out and said they had two sources reporting that he had been arrested. There was rumor going around that he was in Lefortovo prison, but a bunch of people are counteracting that. For what it's worth, the Financial Times came out and said that their sources say that Surovkin had been detained, but was not necessarily in prison. This first item in the nest, tweet by Kevin Rothrock, is once again, he's the editor of Medusa, he's saying that it seems like Surovkin was questioned but not detained, and potentially released, but sort of told, don't go anywhere. And that first item in the nest is that Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, first of all, was dismissive of the New York Times claim that he had any advanced knowledge of the revolt. And then separately, it's not reported in that item in the nest, but separately, when asked about his location, Peskov refused to specify earlier today. So we have a couple hands up. I'm going to go to Jacoby as co-host, and then I think it was Jane, and then Nick. Go ahead, Jacoby.
Just a quick question about the whereabouts of Surovkin and the others who made those statements, and whether or not he was, detained or not. It struck me that at least one, if not both, of the other high-level military guys whose names escape me, so I'm sorry, seemed to be in the same location. Like their background looked the same, the table looked very similar. Would they not have also been in a similar situation, possibly detained? I'm just curious that they zeroed in on Surovkin and not whether the others were detained as well.
So my understanding is that there's sort of been a watch on all the senior figures and saying, where are they? Who have we seen? Who haven't we seen? So when Shoigu was seen at the meeting, and then at some subsequent official functions, his name kind of got scratched off the list as immediately at risk. There were claims that Surovkin hasn't been seen since the video was released immediately, like the day following the revolt beginning, where he called on Wagner not to continue. And people noted that he looked uncomfortable. He had a weapon on his lap. Dara Massicott, analyst at the Rand Corporation, has noted that he wasn't wearing his rank tabs, which she says she's watched him in demonstrations for a long time and not seen him without his rank tabs. So I think that's why they were zeroing in on him, plus his known friendliness to Wagner. However, I'll note that there are other people who are being watched. So some have talked about Medvedev and saying, well, Medvedev hasn't been seen very much. And the response to that has been, well, apparently he traveled to the United Arab Emirates is the last I heard about it. The other general who made a video, I think his name is Alexeyev. I don't think he's been seen either. So the kind of unofficial version is that it seems like a lot of senior people are kind of being held, not literally held, but sort of stay where you are. We're doing some digging, and we'll see who we can get back to and sort of say, yeah, we're confident in your loyalty. And it seems like some are getting closer attention than others. However, reports of sort of widespread purges, I think Rybar came out with that claim. I'm not seeing in independent sources widespread purges. It just seems to be investigations, like Shoigu's deputy, Surovkin's deputy. Okay, we'll go to Kitty as co-host, then Jane, then Nick. Go ahead, Kitty.
I was going to say that Surovkin is a natural target because he's so powerful and because he wanted the job. He wanted to get rid of, he was in line and to get that job. Right?
Could certainly be. Jane, please go ahead.
Sure. I think that just what you said there, Kitty, all of these players have loyalties to that, prior to this all happening. And now what we've been told about them, I've been trying to backtrack a little bit to see where everybody's loyalties appear to lie before this all happened. And it's been hard to find this out. And the fact that so many of these guys have gone to ground, including Medvedev, and Sorokin, et cetera, et cetera. This is clearly still a very dynamic situation. And I think that, I don't know, from my point of view, Sorokin has gotten himself in a tricky place because of his stated loyalties to Wagner, or at least to Prigozhin, and which is Wagner. But I think that, it is a fascinating thing. If you look at Vladimir Putin right now, he is a guy that's got to try to put a whole lot of stuff back in place. And many people, let's say, reorganized and potentially purged. And I think that some of his old KGB training may be what he's heavily counting on right now, to look at everybody, but almost in a paranoid way. And I think as things shake out here, it's going to be very interesting to see how all of the players come down at the end of the day. And I realize that's sort of just a kidding thing, but at the same time, so many things are, I guess that it's just the loyalty matter is so critical to Putin, and he's got to be operating just at maximum paranoid KGB officer. And I think that may influence how he decides who's good, who's bad, and who's got to go, and how far they need to go. Whether to Laportova or gone off this earth or whatever. It's just, we've got some, like I said, pieces of the puzzle are missing. But it's really, really a compelling thing to look at where everybody was a few weeks ago and who their stated loyalties were to and where we are now. There's some inconsistency there that's interesting to look at.
A lot of references made to Putin's past in intelligence, and the idea of surviving the Russian political game, giving him lots of skills. There's also the possibility that the things he learned aren't appropriate to the given moment. So it doesn't seem like he's been making terrific decisions so far. And so I wonder a little bit if that idea is overplayed. Not that Jane is suggesting that, it's a huge advantage to him, but I do wonder if he actually learned some lessons that might be hurting him in the current moment.
It could be weighing him down considerably. I don't disagree with you with that.
Okay, Nick, go ahead. Then we'll move on to discussion of events in Africa, and then we're almost on updates on Wagner. We'll get to the offensive.
Well, I was just interested in people's thoughts. To me, loyalty, you either earn it or you buy it. And in many respects, Putin has bought his loyalty. I mean, what is Wagner Group? They're mercenaries. You're buying their loyalty, and or the oligarchs, or whatever generals you bring them up, you're buying their loyalty. So that's kind of I've heard everybody talk about everything, but it's like, I know there's got to be money involved somewhere. And so who didn't get paid off or enough or whatever to lose that loyalty? I mean, loyalty may or may not go so far. And that's just kind of something I wanted to throw out for people's opinions. Thank you.
Well, you've definitely asked a question that got people's attention, lots of hands. Just before I get to hands, we have a bunch of requests to speak, and the panel is fairly full. So if you have spoken and we move you down to listener, no offense, you can always request and come back up again. I think the order was OPSEC and then Mark. Go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, so I think that's a very complicated statement. So I don't think it's unfair to say that Wagner is made up of mercenaries. But at the same time, it's very different from, what we've previously seen in terms of mercenaries. This is not like the mercenaries that we saw coming out of South Africa, that spread through the conflicts in places like Angola or Sierra Leone. These folks are intrinsically tied to a pipeline from, GRU as well as VDV. They were co-located at a GRU base, Molkino. So they aren't completely outside of the Russian military apparatus. And they've been used for a long time and have sort of lost a little bit of this value as plausible deniability. But they were still operating and funded directly by the MOD, taking orders from the MOD in terms of where they deployed. And one of the things that I actually think was really smart on the part of Prigozhin, and I hate to give him any credit, but he started appearing in Ukraine in these military fatigues. Up until that point, which I think was in April, he had no connections, openly to the military outside of catering. Outside of these contracts for providing, foodstuffs. Everybody kind of knew he was funding Wagner, but he never came out and said it. And then in September of 2022, he came out and admitted that he was the person behind Wagner. And that's when we saw him take this much more public role, speaking in prisons and expanding his profile. And I think in some ways that has lent him protection. And I think at one point, maybe there was an option to fund Wagner outside of Prigozhin. Like if they took that apparatus away from him, maybe there was another option. But now he is intrinsically tied. He is the funding not only for Wagner, but also for the resource trading entities and the mining companies that are extracting the resources in places like CAR, South Sudan, Mali, Libya. So he has just completely baked himself into this puzzle, and it puts Putin in a very precarious position in terms of getting rid of him.
Yes, certainly complicated. We'll try to the extent we can to unpick some elements of it based on what's been said, but we'll run through this discussion. I'm going to go to Kitty as co-host and then to Mark. Go ahead, Kitty.
Thanks. OPSEC, we know in general about how Wagner operates in Syria, Mali, CAR, and all that, but it's somewhat superficial, I think, our knowledge, and I would be really interested to know a little bit more about why they're there, how did they get there, what kind of government exists in each place, and then a few more actual details about how it actually works on the ground between them and the governments and their business.
So I'll try and answer that quickly, but I think the perfect case study would be Mali, because that's one of the more recent ones where we actually saw deployment of Wagner. Obviously, we know that they've been in Syria and Libya longer. They've been exercising sort of, these mining rights that they've acquired in South Sudan and supporting the government in Central African Republic. But I think Mali was the one that was probably most reported on and caught the most attention because this happened just before the invasion. So if we go back to December of 21, that's when, this really hit the scene. I forget which think tank did this reporting on whether or not Mali was building this base in Bamako. Since then, it's become very clear that they were. And, if you want to talk about the governments that they're supporting in Libya, they're supporting Haftar, who is trying to challenge the Tripoli-based government that's recognized by the United States. and the UN in Tripoli, and he's doing that from Benghazi, and he's trying to take control of the oil grounds in what's known as the Fertile Crescent, as well as some of the ones further south. In Syria, he's supporting someone who, Assad was on his back foot at the time, so he's coming in and providing support there. And with Mali, you have this country that suffered a coup in August of 2020, and then a subsequent coup in May of 21. And so it's always countries that are in turmoil. And again, Central African Republic, I think when they came in, the government was estimated to have control of about 30%, maybe, of the land in that country. So they never go into a country where everything's going well. And if we look at Mali, they were going in there to secure the interests of that government. And they did that at the expense of the civilians in that country. And Mali was facing not only a coup, but a very dire security situation as elements tied to the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda were trying to take control of the country. And what they did was use propaganda against the French, who had been operating with or under what they call Barkhane, which was this French operation that goes across the Sahel to try and combat these forces. And so once you have this coup, they use this anti-French sentiment to really insert themselves into the politics of the country. And the coup was then using them, the leadership of the coup was using them for close protection. They were there under this guise of training, but at the same time, they were going out on these missions and committing these atrocities. And they came to power saying that they were going to fix the security situation.
So
and
have been
that's a huge problem.
Sorry. Would it be Putin who brought them in, or how was it negotiated? Was it Wagner itself, or how do they insinuate themselves?
Yeah, so that conversation is going to be happening with people like Lavrov, and Lavrov has made several visits to Mali. So it is the Russian, government institutions that are sort of organizing this, and then Prigozhin is the beneficiary, and they go in there. I think the original estimate, which has probably increased, was about $10 million a month. That's what it would cost for, Wagner's presence. It has almost certainly increased, but Mali wasn't in a place to pay that. So the way Russia secured that payment was through things like resource rights. And we didn't see that right away. But, we've seen them, more and more looking at some of these gold interests. I think this has been undermined by the war in Ukraine. So Mali isn't the best example for this, because I do think in the long run, the goal was to set up mining of bauxite, which is very important for aluminum, which is something that Russia has, several large companies producing. They've struggled to even set up that gold mining. But the thing about gold mining is it can be done on a very small scale. So it wouldn't surprise me if they do have ties to that industry, just not overly reported on. And this is not just something that, this money is going to the Russian state to pay for this. It's also going into Prigozhin's pockets.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the businesses themselves, but I think Michael would like to go to some hands, and then we'll come back to a little more detail.
Yeah, just want to make sure we get through folks while they're waiting. I believe it was Mark and then Patrick. Go ahead, Mark.
Yes, thank you, Michael. This is a great discussion and great panel. I don't mean to be patronizing, but I've had a question ever since this palace intrigue happened last week, and I've not had the answer. And this is a great group of people with a lot of knowledge and intelligence that may have the answer. And the question is what will be the impact on Russia's war in Ukraine from this palace intrigue and this attempted coup attempt? the chaos involved with it. Will it have a marginal impact on Russia's war in Ukraine? Is there a moderate impact, or can there be a very large impact on Russia's war in Ukraine? If you discussed this earlier, I apologize. I may not have been listening, or if you want to hold off on it. But I've just been wondering, what is the impact for Ukrainians? Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Mark. That's a big question. It comes while we're kind of in the middle of discussing another point. However, if anybody who has their hands up wants to throw in a response to Mark in your comments, feel free. We have discussed the potential impact on the front in some of our previous spaces. I think the answer at the moment is we don't know for sure. In that it certainly seems like it is having some small impact. You know, there were claims, for example, of Chechen fighters potentially being drawn off from the occupied territories in a way that may have thinned out lines. We also talked about the fact that Wagner may have been, counted on as sort of a deeper reserve, even though they had been withdrawn from Bakhmut to sort of reform. They may have factored into longer term plans, so that could have a sort of more medium term impact. Of course, the damage politically to Putin and his trust in his commanders is what could have the most significant impact, but the degree of that impact is sort of something that we're discussing now with regard to, command changes and so on. But if anybody else wants to toss into Mark's question as we go along, please feel free. I'm going to keep going in the hand order I think we had. Apologies, I didn't see it exactly, but I think it was Patrick, and then Radio and Nukes, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Michael. And I will echo the we don't know part of how this impacts Ukraine. It's probably not good for the Russian army, but I don't think anybody can really say how exactly it's going to affect them just yet. Someone mentioned earlier the notion that this may have kicked off because somebody didn't get paid, the Wagner mutiny. I would offer a little bit of a different kind of take on this. Wagner is not Blackwater. Wagner is not, name any Western PMC who's been active in the past 30 years. Wagner looks more like something you might have seen in the Italian wars in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. They are an actual private army. And the one thing that actual private armies hate is to have their people chewed up for no reason, because those are their resources, that's their inventory. And they have a history of turning on their employers when that happens. So if I'm Prigozhin and I've got these idiots Shoigu and Gerasimov throwing my guys into a meat grinder, and that's going to inhibit my ability to make money after this war is over, because the conscripts and the prisoners who are used in these human wave attacks, I don't care about them. If I'm Prigozhin, I don't care about them. They don't matter to me. What matters to me are the very well-trained ex-VDV, ex-Spetsnaz guys who have skill sets that I can't replace in short order, especially with a war on, when they're needed by the regular Russian forces. And if we listen to some of Prigozhin's rhetoric during the mutiny, it kind of echoes that this lambasting of the regular Russian MOD at the senior level, saying, they're incompetent, they're throwing us into a meat grinder. If they hadn't been in charge, the war would be over by now. He made a lot of military populist statements about how they had mistreated the Russian soldiery. And I think, that I think has not yet been given its full weight in some circles. I don't necessarily think this was about who wasn't getting paid enough. I think this was about a genuine dissatisfaction with some serious incompetence and a threat to Prigozhin's own power. We shouldn't, overlook that either. But I do think he really was, or at least seemed to be, very disgusted with just the lack of competent leadership from the Russian MOD.
Which is partly why I'm cautious. So in the immediately following the revolt launching, I highlighted it might not make sense to assume that everybody involved here are rational actors or that they have full information. And some have argued that, Putin's motivations, may not be with regard to popularity at all. In the same way, Prigozhin may be in some ways motivated more to maintain loyalty because that's where he sees the value as opposed to immediate business interests. So I think that Patrick's right, which also means that it's a little less transparent for us to impute his motives. I saw OPSEC's hand pop up just because he's so focused on Wagner. Well, let's go to OPSEC to respond. Then we'll go to Radio and Nukes and then David.
Yeah, so I was just going to say I really agree with what Patrick was saying there. And I think it's also, worth noting that in the early days of this war, people who were following Wagner saw some of the people that they had been following, like Nagin or the guy who was originally running Gray Zone, who went by the call sign 500, some of the people we had been tracking for war crimes in Libya as well, I forget the call sign off the top of my head, were killed in Ukraine. That is not something that we're really seeing at this point. And so it seems like Wagner sort of did exactly what Patrick was talking about and pulled these people away from the front, and they were more directing these, prison conscripts that they had acquired. They've also kept a lot of these people that come from the pipeline that, we were talking about before, in places, where they're operating in Africa or the Middle East. So they're not pulling those resources because, again, to Patrick's point, they're more valuable. So I think, it's worth noting that their whole approach in Ukraine has also changed. And it's not like they're not still utilizing these mining rights in places like Mali, Central African Republic, or Sudan.
Thanks for that. And we will get to the African updates in just a moment. Radio and Nukes, and then David.
Yeah. So I guess this is more of a question, but first of all, I don't have any idea how this is going to affect the war. I don't think many do. But what does Prigozhin's access to hard cash look like at this point? They're supposedly going to roll Wagner units in with the MOD, which I assume at that point they're not going to be able to perform their business activities. So to me, cash is his lifeline. And he's probably going to do everything he can to keep that cash flow system functioning. I just don't know. I'm sure it's extremely complicated, but what does the access to currency for Wagner look like, and specifically for Prigozhin ongoing?
So that's a terrific question. Maybe even highlighted more by the fact that when they searched the Wagner offices, they found these trucks filled with cash, demonstrating their reliance on it. I can't know the specific answer, but part of the reason I highlighted these indications that Prigozhin may be traveling back to Russia, it makes me think that he's permitted to do that to settle his affairs. I would assume that if the Kremlin is letting him do that because they need him to take care of some organization for Wagner purposes, that he's also probably secretly trying to rush as much as he can to line up his own access to resources. And I would also imagine that there's sort of a counter-espionage game going on from the Kremlin trying to monitor where he's trying to marshal resources, cash, and so on. I would assume that more than many oligarchs, he has access to resources from Wagner's operations abroad. But how much that is versus how much they need, I just don't know. The fact that Putin came out and said that they had spent $1 billion directly to Wagner, or sent $1 billion directly to Wagner, and then another $1 billion to the Concord Catering Group, my assumption is that those contracts with the Concord Group for catering are now over, or winding up shortly. It begs the question, if he's going to have 8,000 fighters in Belarus, where are those 8,000 fighters going to get their money from? Besides Prigozhin's personal resources, and that presumably that will remain expensive. The answer is I don't know, but if anybody does or is looking at it closely, let us know. Great question, by the way. I'm going to go to Kitty, if you have a substantive question, maybe we can hold it. If you have an admin point, we can go ahead, though.
No, it's substantive. You can.
Okay, if you don't mind waiting a moment. So we'll go to David and then Jane. Go ahead, David.
If the numbers are correct, if we're and I know it's a crapshoot, but if we're looking at the 25,000 number of Wagner, all those guys are suspect, so they're probably melting away or turning in their stuff and going home. If I was a battlefield commander, I would not be giving them a weapon at all, and I wouldn't. They're toxic. They're just toxic. You don't want them in the unit. So if we're going with 25,000 number, that's about 5% of the troops that are in Ukraine right now on the Russian side. But that's quantitatively. Qualitatively wise, there's probably about 10 to 15% of the entire attack force in Ukraine. Now, the other issue is the 22nd Special Forces, the 150th Division, and all the other divisions or major units that flip sides or passively helped or actively helped, whatever. You're probably not going to see much right now because those units are actually deployed in Ukraine, and their rear echelon, their communications, some of their communications, their headquarters, and their stay back and their training battalions helped out. So those units will probably be gutted of senior personnel. And what's going to happen is you're going to see like 22nd Special Purpose Force that is fighting the 47th Ukrainian brigade directly right now. They're probably going to be calling home and expecting to talk to Colonel such and such or Major such and such, and that guy's gone, and that's going to weigh heavily on morale, and you're going to have people, why am I here type thing. And the only other thing I want to touch on is unless you've been to combat, once you get home from being in combat and everything, you look at everybody else like they're creatures from another world. And so Prigozhin, every time I saw him talking, talking about his troops or anything, he always had his troops in the background. Either the dead troops that he was saying this shouldn't have happened, or his troops in the background. He always had them there, and he was always in tactical gear or 511 gear or something like that. And so putting bodies in bags for a year will change you. And I think he got generally tired of it and saw an opportunity to get out of it, get back to what he liked doing, making money. And this was his last Thunder run. And that's what I was, I can't imagine putting the troops that you trained with, sat with, had coffee with, joked with every single day, putting them in body bags because you weren't authorized more ammo than you were requesting, or the basic stuff that you were requesting, you weren't getting. And you were put on the same level as that idiot conscript unit right across the street from you or right across the hill from you. They're getting the same stuff that you're getting, and they're wasting it when you could be using it correctly. That's what I got to say.
Yeah, thanks, David. The idea of motivation in terms of, being forces, troops oriented is a good one, and that kind of echoes Patrick's point about him potentially being dedicated to the force and maybe not as motivated by money. Also, one interesting implication is if his loyalty to him is highest among the most experienced forces, it might also mean that whoever remains with him will be more of a top-heavy organization. I also saw some speculation about the possibility of Wagner beginning to recruit somewhat within Belarus, which would present interesting opportunities. So the hands have kind of changed up. I just want to go with responses to what was just said. I think Patrick and OPSEC were going to respond, and then I'll go around. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thanks, Michael. I'll collect my thought here. Sorry about that. OPSEC, if you want to go ahead, I need to collect my thought here for a second.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think there were a few things that you brought up. First of all, I think, it's worth pointing out that not everyone involved with the Wagner Group is fighting on the front lines. There is a logistics element to that. There's also the artillery element to that. I don't know if we know that they were actually facing the level of shortages that Wagner was claiming. I would love to see, direct evidence of that, but it's also possible that this was all part of this, propaganda war against the MOD. And that's something that has kind of been creeping more and more into my thoughts, especially after, what we saw recently. And then I would also add that, Wagner has already seen a lot of attrition outside of Ukraine. So I know I bring this up all the time, but Battle of Kharsham, very important to look at when considering, how Prigozhin has interacted historically with the MOD and how they have interacted with him, which was when they got absolutely destroyed when they tried to confront the United States under the orders of the MOD, and then no aid was rendered. And also the fact that, several people who were operating for Wagner have been arrested for, operating as mercenaries. So it's nothing new to see Prigozhin, or at the time, I think a lot of people were thinking Utkin, undermined by the MOD. So yes, I think, this is a completely different scale in terms of the losses that they have faced. But I don't think that necessarily alone would be the motivating factor. I think there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we will learn about in the coming weeks, months, or years.
Thanks for that, OPSEC. We're going to go to Kitty and then to Jane. And if so Patrick actually is just available now. We'll go Patrick and then Kitty. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thanks, Michael. I'll be brief. David, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing, as Michael was alluding to earlier, the Wagner kept in its own units. And depending on just how suspect they're thought to be, they may be used as expendable shock troops until those guys are effectively eliminated. That, depending on the threat perception from the Kremlin, that wouldn't surprise me at all. They may not be allowed to go home.
Thanks for that, Patrick. Kitty, and then Jane.
Yeah, just to what you were saying, David, I think, when Prigozhin was ragging on Shoigu and Gerasimov, he was actually telling the truth. Like, they were totally screwing up the prosecution of the war. They weren't supporting, and they didn't have enough. Their operational plans weren't good, and so they weren't supporting the troops properly. So every single complaint that he had about those two was true, which he finally started saying out loud, and he saw on the ground. So when it came time, the contract was July 1st that he was supposed to go in and become subservient or under Shoigu's, contract. Then it's easy to see why he would balk at coming under the command of these idiots. And so then there are other people too who've seen that and who've been on the ground in all parts of it, who would slowly accumulate on his side, I think.
So we'll go to David in just a moment. I'll just make the point that I haven't actually seen a draft of that Ministry of Defense contract. I pay close attention, but I can't see everything. So if anybody has seen that, please do bring it to my attention, because the terms of it interest me. Go ahead, David.
I'm going to give you a really quick story, and I'm sure Patrick can vouch for this. I was with the 101st, and the 101st is in the U.S. 18th Airborne Corps, which all the special snake eaters, all the crazy guys are in. And what happens is we would get the special forces guys that would they couldn't jump anymore or anything like that, and so they would go into what's called the big army. Okay, and when you go from special forces or something like Wagner, which almost everybody in Wagner was special forces pretty much, that were the cadre. You couldn't come back to the regular army. You can't. You will get so disgusted, you'll start shooting people. It's a special world, and when you have people try to force those guys back into the big army footprint, it never ends well. And I cannot see Wagner, the troops of Wagner, coming back in and being used as shock troops, because they'll take out.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that was just an administrative thing because the mute button is on the add button. Please go ahead, David.
Oh, sorry, I don't know where I stopped at then. What I'm saying is, when you have former special forces or former shock troops or really good quality troops, and they're forced to go back into being with conscripts or being with whatever, it never ends well. You can say they're going to be used for shock troops, but I've been seeing anecdotal evidence of guys taking their stuff and just melting away. And Russia's a big country, so these guys, I wouldn't be surprised if half of them that are not going to Belarus pick up their gear and just walk off. And you'll probably be saying that because they're under no legal. Remember, this is still not a war. They're not under any legal restriction under the MOD to stay there. They can just drop their stuff and go. And trying to put high quality special forces into a unit with a bunch of dead enders, I can't see that. They're not going to be there. They're going to be going home.
David, in the American context, you're exactly right. In the Russian context, these are the people that shoot their own people at the drop of a hat for leaving the battlefield. I don't know how willing they'll be to use violence against a group that looks like it just tried to mutiny against the president.
Yeah, but they've already. I'm seeing some evidence that when they were told to go back to the Ukraine, some of them just melted away. I
wouldn't doubt it.
And that's what I'm saying. Once you get a few of them going, then you'll have more and more. Because there's not going to be any. Nobody's going to know who's got the grenades, who's got the RPGs, who's got the AKs, and you just put it in your truck and go home with it, as we've been seeing guys killing themselves with hand grenades and stuff like that. And you're not going to be loved. You're probably going to be sent to a unit that's going to use you as, a reconnaissance by fire. And they know this because they've been using those prisoners for that. And how would you like to be on the receiving end of that after you just did it to this guy? And any unit you get sent to, you're going to be radioactive. You're going to be toxic. It's like when you get a dud in from another unit, everybody already knows that you're toxic. You'll get there and they'll start the out processing paperwork before you even sign in.
100%, yeah.
And so
I agree with you. If the Russians had any brains whatsoever, they would take these guys and they would form an American-style training unit for their conscripts coming in. They'd put political officers watching over their shoulders to make sure they weren't teaching them to hate Putin, and they would actually use these guys' skills. But there's going to be some leakage.
Or break them down, find out what their original units were, the 22nd, the 45th, the VDV or whatever, and say, you're going back to it. But legally, they can't do it because legally, it's still not a war. So legally, in a few hours, because the first is tomorrow, right? Or no, in 2 days, they are contractless, and they can literally drop their gear and walk home.
Right, but you and I know they're going to legality doesn't matter to Putin. He's going to do whatever he wants. But I mean, you're right. If you're going to slot them into a line unit, you may as well send them back to where they came from. That'd be the best option.
Yeah, but they're not going to do that because they're toxic. And units like, I'm thinking the 22nd, the 45th, they're right next to each other. They're probably going to be co-located and they may be merged because 22nd is now unreliable.
So, and I appreciate that this is, opinion coming from people who have firsthand experience. How this actually winds up shaking out will be difficult to get insight into from where we are. I think something we might want to also consider is the speed at which these changes take place, to the extent that if they do set up a training corps in Belarus and a lot of the senior Wagner staff, stays united, then there's probably a greater likelihood of people looking at their options and seeing that as more acceptable to them. Those who have experience. Well, there were also reports in one of the articles that X had highlighted about the fact that some of these forces are still in combat, or they're just hanging out in the so-called LNR, DNR, and that they may be taking their time to make their decisions. And so if it can be pulled together before a bulk has to decide what to do, I'm sure there are those who are deciding immediately, but there are probably some who either are delayed or will take their time. It will be interesting to see where they wind up and how quickly, there is the appearance of stability or not. There were several hands that went up, I think, in response to David. I understand, Jane's been waiting a very long time. I'm just going to go to the hands that went up in response to David. So I'm going to go to OPSEC and then Schizo, and then we'll go to Jane. Go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, so I put something in the nest. It's, I think, 2, maybe 3 back now. I agree. The people that come from that GRU VDV pipeline are the most loyal to Prigozhin, before that Utkin. I don't see a viable way to incorporate them into the MOD. But I think where Patrick was coming from is the forces that you see operating in Ukraine, by and large, are not the same as we have typically thought about Wagner. And when giving analysis on Wagner, this has been a constant, point of issue for me, is this is a different organization currently operating within Ukraine than the previous iterations that we saw operating in the Donbass, and certainly different than what we've seen operating in Africa. And so the MOD has already taken over the pipeline from prison in terms of conscripts. So I think you could very easily see some of those people incorporated into the MOD and the larger fight. And I think maybe what Patrick was getting at with, sort of these shock troops would be, what we've seen some evidence of with barrier forces, just continue the tactics that they were using in Bakhmut, just under different leadership. And I think those people would be much easier to incorporate into the larger infrastructure of, the Russian security apparatus than, those elite forces that a lot of us think of when we think of Wagner.
Yeah, thanks for that, OPSEC. Schizo, did you want to respond?
Yeah, this was just in relation to the earlier question about cash. I did some Googling. They probably have at least 2 to 4 billion US on hand. Just that's a conservative estimate based off the gold mining just from Sudan and the Central African Republic alone. Example, in 2021, just in profit gold mining, they had 1.9 billion US worth of gold. In Sudan, they purchased gold by the truck. It didn't specify what size truck, but they purchased gold by truck for $4 US per truckload. And again, for 2021, just for Sudan gold, it's estimated about almost $2 billion of unaccounted gold expected to have gone to Wagner, and that's just from Central African Republic and Sudan just for the year of 2021. They additionally, from 2011 to 2019, from contracts in parentheses from the Russian state, an additional 3 billion contracts from 2018 to 2022. Throughout Africa was an additional 250 contracts. So they probably have at least, several billion on hand in US dollars. So in terms of rubles, you're looking at like tens of billions in moves.
That's assuming that they, invested it or husbanded it wisely. Excuse me. It may also depend on how rapidly the Kremlin moves against those assets, which some of which may be subject to negotiation, some of which may be just how quickly they can get there. I saw OPSEC's hand pop up. So OPSEC, if you want to respond quickly, then we'll go to Jane.
Yeah, I'll definitely be quick. So I wouldn't be surprised if they had, hundreds of millions. I do think some of that got funneled into, the larger, Kremlin apparatus. And also keeping in mind that a lot of the assets that they have received come from MOD. A lot of these contracts were probably, originally acquired through the MOD. I think some of this has gone to Prigozhin and Wagner at large. And I think they're taking far more than we would expect from the, face value of the contracts. But I also wouldn't be surprised if some of that money has either already gone to the Kremlin, or if the Kremlin takes actions to then secure it, after what we saw with the mutiny.
We'll let one last interjection from Schizo, then Jane. Go ahead, Schizo.
Yeah, so with the gold mining, I would not be surprised if there's a decent portion that goes to the Russian government, but unfortunately we just don't have the data on how much goes directly back to the state. But in terms of the gold mining, particularly in both Sudan and the Central African Republic, Wagner outright and Prigozhin personally owns the entire companies. It's like one of them is Midas. There's a couple other companies that he has direct ownership over in Sudan, where he's the owner, operator, CEO, all that nice stuff. So like he's getting decent amount from just pocketing from those gold mines, particularly in Sudan.
But it's also worth, I would say, keeping in mind that, what is ownership in Putin's Russia? And a lot of that does end up going back into Putin's coffers, because that is sort of how he's operated, his influence over the oligarch class.
To that end, and because, as usual, we're not going to have time to get through all the material I had prepared, I won't speak to it in detail. The first should be the first item that will populate in the nest in a moment, hopefully, is my tweet on resources, which for me, I think just showed up. Yeah, so it's front of the nest. It's titled Resources. These are just a few of the recent reports, including one contributed to by All Eyes on Wagner, and then a whole bunch of material brought together by the DFR lab, and some maps and so on. Some of those maps come with cautionary tales, by the way. So if you want to dig into, reports on what Wagner owns and where they operate, there are some resources there. But those are just from the last few days. There's plenty more beyond that. Jane, you've been waiting a very long time. Thank you for being patient. Go ahead.
No problem. I've been listening to what's going on and what everybody has said. And I think that, it's an interesting thing that we're seeing unfold. Putin has run Russia through two things: fear, with a side order of violence when needed, and money. And, at least in, areas and managing people, let's put it that way, over time, he's never built himself a mercenary army. And I think it's causing him more trouble than he could possibly believe. It's sort of like never turn your back on the ocean or a private mercenary army. And I think he may have done that a slight bit here, gotten an amazingly well-trained army under Prigozhin, and is in a really bad position because of what's happened. I agree with the fact that I think part of Prigozhin's noise about supplies to Shugoi has been some theater. as well as potentially necessity, but there's theater in there. And I think at the end of the day, the only way this is going to resolve for anybody, and I think the guys who are the fighters that have worked for Wagner are in a tough spot. I don't see them as, I think Patrick and several other people have noted, these guys are not normal troops. How are they going to find themselves getting folded back into a more normal type of unit? I just don't see that happening. And you have an awful lot of things that could blow up going on underneath you, human beings that could get very angry about what's happening. And I think that everybody is going to play the fear and money game. And my thought about Prigozhin, he's a smart guy. He has offshored a rainy day fund for himself. That's just a guess, but I cannot believe he doesn't have some money that he has got stashed away, in Crete or somewhere that isn't under the control of the Kremlin and that he can use for his own purposes. So I think that there are things here. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, but I just keep looking at fear money. Is it Africa? Is it Belarus? And who survives at the end of the day? Those things, I think everybody that's spoken has really spoken all to those issues. And getting your head around all of it is the hard part right now. But thank you very much.
Okay, Jane, thank you. Aaron, would you like to go ahead, and then we'll do the Africa updates?
Sure. So I think that if we see, I'll agree with exactly, I'm not sure who said it, but whoever said that they should have used their Wagner's people as trainers, some of their best, most seasoned veterans as trainers for the Russian army, for the conscripts. You're bang on, because it's stupid for them to not use their training in this, and I think that we're seeing the collapse and continued collapse of the Russian. I'll call it the Russian brain drain. We've been seeing this throughout since the shutdown, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've been seeing that. When it comes to industry, we've been seeing that when it comes to military, we've been seeing that when it comes to doctors, medical. We've been seeing that when it comes to a lot of things. This here really is no different. Now that a lot of the best soldiers and even the Wagner forces, if they can't come home without, and they're not going to be used, effectively, if they can't come home, then they're probably going to be killed, imprisoned. Putin is petrified just as much as Stalin was, or more, after the Second World War. Stalin was just as petrified and scared during the Purge in the 30s, and he was even more so in the late 40s and after the Second World War. It really, a lot of things came down to, people just being arrested or there at work one day and then not the next. This is the scenario we're looking at in Russia right now. Thanks. Yep.
Yep. As insightful an analysis as ever. So quick updates. Then I'm running through in the nest on developments in Africa. A few materials have gone up in the front, so I'm starting from the fifth item back in the nest. So there's a tweet there by Kevin Rothrock, editor at Medusa, who noted that Peskov came out just the other day to make the statement that the Russian state had no involvement in Wagner Group's African operations, which, coming from Peskov, obviously hard to believe, but interesting data point with regard to what the Kremlin may do to Wagner's Wagner's African operations. And I know hands are going to pop up. I'm just going to run through the African updates, and then we'll go around because I suspect there will be lots of people who want to contribute. The sixth item back in the nest is a tweet from Jack Margolin. And so there have been a couple of interesting developments. And again, Wagner's operations in Wagner's operations in Africa are not a monolith, so it's country specific. Specifically in the Central African Republic, the president there gave a statement to Agence France Presse saying that their government's arrangements were with the Russian government and not directly with Wagner, suggesting that if other PMCs were to come through, that they would, as promoted by the Russian government, that they would work with them, which is a different spin on it. But then the next tweet back, the seventh, this one is from the account Drew Hinshaw, and that Russia has been apparently, the Kremlin has made efforts to seize control of Wagner operations in Africa. And so apparently Russian diplomats have been going around assuring governments in Africa and the Middle East that Wagner's operations there will continue, but that they will move under Moscow's management. And so that's drawn from the article by the Wall Street Journal on Putin's move to seize control of Wagner's global empire. So check that article out for more detail. However, there were some other items that I'll have to put back up in the nest. They may have been cut. Following the statement of the president of the Central African Republic that they would accept other Russian PMCs, there was then a claim that the defense minister, so I believe it was a Wagner Telegram account, that claimed that the defense minister of the Central African Republic turned around and apologized to Wagner and said the comments of the president weren't how their government intended to proceed, suggesting there may be either deceit or a lack of coordination in the government of the Central African Republic. So that was presented as being a little bit of a mess. I also have 2 points that I'll put up in the nest about Syria, where apparently Russia sent diplomats to the Syrian government and claimed that Wagner forces would no longer be involved in the fighting in Syria. And then there were also some reports that came out from Kommersant, which is a Russian newspaper, saying that several Wagner senior individuals had been arrested in Syria. All of which is interesting with regard to their operations there. So I'm going to put those up in the nest to back up what I've just said. But we have a couple of hands, so why don't we go to OPSEC and then exit? Go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, so I think the claims coming from any country or from Russia saying that they're not tied to their operations in Africa are blatantly false. We've seen some of these deliveries, again, looking specifically to Mali, of, the Frogfoot. So we saw the Su-25. We've seen the Mi-24Ps, I believe Mi-17s or Mi-8s. I'd have to look at the tail rotor again. But these are being supplied by the MOD. They're being operated by Wagner. Same thing goes for a lot of the mechanized equipment that we've seen them operating, such as like T-72s in Syria. So again, they're intrinsically tied to the MOD. Whether or not the MOD leadership wants that to be true, I think is a different question, but I don't think there's any argument that there's no tie.
Thanks for that. Exit, please go ahead.
Just to add to the Africa story today, there was reports out of Libya saying that There's a couple different ways it's reported. Some people had reported it as unidentified jets. Sorry, I'm house sitting and there's birds in the background, so my apologies to all of you. Unidentified jets had struck a Wagner base in Libya today, and then there's other reports that have said specifically that it is government jets that are striking that base today in Libya, and that they were specifically using Turkish drones to do that, which is really interesting. My question was for OPSEC. Oh, go ahead on that, OPSEC.
Yeah, so just quickly, I had not heard about that. Do you know if it was at the airport at Benina, outside Benghazi?
Check your DMs, Al.
To help you out there, Exit, I had put in the nest the one claim I saw on the front about the use of drones in Libya, but I'm seeing it as local reporting, unconfirmed, so it's from this single source. With regard to the strike on the Wagner base, I saw a claim about that 2 or 3 days ago, just as the revolt was wrapping up. But I thought that was there was a claim that Syria had, Russian MOD forces had struck a Wagner base in Syria. But perhaps we're talking about different things.
Yeah, I think those are two different things. The one in Libya. Sorry, go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, I was just going to say that seems like a very dangerous operation for them to undertake. So the Wagner forces are backing Haftar, and so that is why I'm assuming it's at Benina, which is outside of Benghazi. But the Russian forces are not the only ones there, and so there are other countries that are located in very close proximity at that airfield. In what was supposed to be a new terminal, including some of the countries in the Middle East that deny operating there, but we have seen, significant support from, say, UAE.
So there are other reports of that. I'll put a few others up in the net. But I guess my question was specifically, you have followed Wagner for a very long time. What are you watching going forward?
I mean, that's a deep question. I think the biggest thing that I am looking at is Prigozhin and the footprint in Africa. And I think that extends past Wagner forces. I do think we need to look at these entities that are involved in the allocation and sale of resources. But to be honest, I would be surprised if Prigozhin ended up in Belarus. Anyone who has this interest in self-preservation, I think, would want to look for somewhere that they were a bit more comfortable. And I also think, as I was saying before, the fact that Prigozhin has come out and sort of owned his ties down to Wagner, which is a huge change from everything that we saw in the run-up to, the full-scale invasion, indicates that he's willing to sort of accept that role. So if he wanted to go somewhere like Mali and rally with those troops that we're talking about, who are more likely to be loyal to him, that wouldn't surprise me. So I guess really all eyes on Prigozhin. Where does he end up? Can we track, these assets that we know are tied to Wagner, the companies that are tied to Wagner? And I think the really difficult part here is there's so much more at play than just Prigozhin and Wagner. And, we're not getting a whole lot out of the Kremlin. So I guess, just looking at those assets and the footprint in Africa and Syria, is going to be easier to identify than anything that's going on inside of Russia right now. And then obviously, whatever we see going on in Ukraine, but the Ukrainians have sort of locked down to some extent what is being reported by the media, and there are also motivations for them to sort of create a narrative there. So I think the most telling place that we can look is Africa.
Since it seems like we may be asking a couple of questions of OPSEC. Just to mix the order up, why don't we go to Kitty, and then we'll see from there.
Yeah, OPSEC, is there any clear lines in terms of the businesses and the revenue flow?
So I think this is what Intel was speaking to before. There are some lines in terms of, funding, what's being extracted, which companies are tied to Prigozhin. But what happens after that, I think, is, where the questions are, and I don't have an answer for that. The Treasury Department in the United States has just put sanctions on 2 companies operating in Sudan. I think I put that up in the nest a little while ago. Have ties to Prigozhin, but all of the companies that are operated by oligarchs in Russia are very opaque. So we don't really know where those funds end up. So we know they're taking and extracting these resources from these countries, but we don't know where, they ultimately end up. What I think is something worth looking at, especially with gold, because it's really easy to extract, would be small-scale operations going on in places like CAR, Mali, and South Sudan, but we can't really account for what's being taken from those. And those would largely happen outside of these larger resource rights. A lot of it is done illegally.
Yeah, and are there separate, is there a separation between the business people, the Wagner businessmen, and the Wagner military? And I imagine there's executives in both areas in all these different places.
I mean, you definitely see crossover, and I think, again, a lot of that is done for obfuscating the reality of that network. So, for example, like one of these organizations that Prigozhin runs, there are these rumors that Utkin has now been, elevated within the Concord group. So that is a direct tie from, who ostensibly was the founder of Wagner coming out of the Slavic Corps and some of the more legitimate business operations. So it's all a network, and there are probably people who can break down that side of it a lot more than I could.
Thanks for that. Just to get a variety of order in, we'll go to Jane and then to exit. Go ahead, Jane.
Hey, OPSEC, I have one question for you. How realistic is it for Russian diplomats to be going to these African countries saying, hey, everything's fine, we've got it under control, the businesses are transferring to us, and everything's cool? Is that something that it's got to be somewhere between questionable to laughable, I would guess, in the eyes of the people that are receiving the message, given what's going on in Russia? Was that be correct, or am I not on course there?
So I think mostly correct in terms of it being, I wouldn't say laughable. I think a year and a half ago, I would have had a very different answer for you. This is kind of what I was outlining before. We started seeing Prigozhin show up in military fatigues, which was a tacit acknowledgement of his ties to the Wagner group. He was showing up with the, one of the deputies of the Duma. And then in September, he completely removed any sort of, question about his ties to that group. And again, I think that was kind of smart. It provides him with top cover and protection because so many of these countries have been reliant on his troops. And these countries are not reliant on sort of like the cannon fodder that we're seeing in Ukraine. To a large extent, these are the people that are the most loyal to him, the ones that have sort of built their name on Wagner. So I think it would be very difficult. I think there are some countries where, we probably have some elements of Wagner providing training through directly through MOD. So Cameroon, for example, not one that's talked about a lot, but that would probably be very easy for MOD to sort of take over the role of Wagner. Somewhere like Mali, Central African Republic, that is going to be much more difficult. And I don't think they can afford to replace that level of troop in those countries with the war going on in Ukraine.
Thanks, OPSEC. I note that there's a listener who is a close observer of operations in Sudan who is saying that Wagner doesn't have any presence in South Sudan at the moment, whether with regard to gold or other operations. So I'll just toss that into the conversation. I think we'll go to Exit and then Austin.
So we've talked about where Prigozhin could end up. I haven't heard mentioned, and maybe that's for good reason, but I thought I'd ask anyways. Is there any of the Middle Eastern countries that he could go and basically have a safe place to stay for a while? Obviously, the UAE has worked financing some of the places that they've been to, or been the bases they've been holding. Is there other options for that? How would that work out? Are those countries too close to Russia specifically instead of just Wagner?
So I can answer that, but I know OPSEC can answer that as well, and I know he's angling towards it, so take it away.
No, so I was just giving thumbs up to say I think Exit kind of hit the nail on the head. I'm looking at African countries. Maybe Austin has a different take. But yeah, I just don't see, considering the ties that places like UAE have to larger Russian interests, them backing someone like Prigozhin and allowing a safe haven. Syria is not an option because, well, Russia's also involved on the ground there, which is unique sort of to Syria compared to the other places where they operate. I just would not pick any of the GCC countries or the Gulf Cooperation Council countries as an endpoint for Prigozhin. But Austin?
Yeah, no, we're in alignment there. When you look at countries that are generally aligned towards Russia, they're aligned towards Russia because of the Russian state. They're not aligned there because of Prigozhin himself. And I understand that many Gulf countries are sort of havens, and many sort of like Southeast Asian nations as well, are havens for people that are willing to bring wealth towards there, right? But that's not a specifically geographical thing. Cyprus had the golden passport for a while, and Malta, to my understanding, still does. That being said, though, when it comes to Wagner, when it comes to areas that they have sort of solidified and everything like that, that all comes with the backing of the Russian state. And so if Prigozhin becomes, this pariah, which I believe he is right now, and anyone willing to disagree with me, I'm willing to hear you out. There's no way Assad is going to, take a look at further Russian support and take a look at Prigozhin and choose Prigozhin over that. There's no way that Burkina Faso is going to, have that same calculus. So in my opinion, Prigozhin right now is up shit creek without a paddle, because this idea that he's safe in Belarus, that this is going to work out, I really don't believe that. So I think the question becomes, because we have seen serious inroads made by Wagner, specifically in West Africa, and that's an area that OPSEC knows more than I do. However, what I will say is I know a ton about French foreign policy, and looking at how French foreign policy has evolved over the last 5 years towards areas like Burkina Faso, like Cameroon, like Mali, has been incredibly interesting to watch, because from the Russian point of view, you've made serious inroads against sort of Western efforts, Western counterterrorism efforts, specifically French, and then with some additions by the United States there as well. That being said, you're also looking at a private military contractor that's willing to drive the equivalent of a motorized rifle brigade to your capital for the sake of changing things up. So I think it'll be a really interesting month to look at how these Wagner deployments in West Africa change, if they do change, towards sort of Russian strategic posture there. That being said, though, I don't believe Yevgeny Prigozhin has an area to go to that is inherently friendly to him nor safe. Because if you look at traditional tax havens, he doesn't have the money for the Bahamas to sacrifice, their tax umbrella status. He doesn't have the friendships to go to a country like Malta and do that. He doesn't have the connections to go to a country like Sri Lanka, who wouldn't be willing to sell him down the road. And then last but certainly not least, he doesn't have to have the backing of the Russian government to end up in an area like Damascus or Burkina Faso. So he is a rare case of someone who has very little friends. And by friends, I mean people who are willing to stake out because they know they have more to benefit than they have to lose. And so my guess is he'll stay in Belarus as long as he can. Maybe he'll turn coat and try to go to Poland. But in my opinion, there are no third-party options for him.
Go ahead, OPSEC.
Yeah, so Austin actually hit on something that I meant to expand on, which is to look at the French and look at Operation Barkhane and what happened to MINUSMA when they withdrew their air support. That is the problem that Wagner is now going to face in Mali, because that air support is being supplied by Russian MOD. It's being operated by Wagner, but as we saw, they crashed the only frogfoot, or the first frogfoot that was sent to Mali within a few months. And so they cannot keep that level of support. It's going to be very difficult for them to continue operations there. The only reason I think I could see Prigozhin going to or choosing specifically Mali or maybe Central African Republic is because of how much support he has among the operators in that location. But I would also agree that there's no good option for him at this point. Maybe he could look to Brunei. It has all of the oil benefits of the Middle East, and it's also in Southeast Asia. So Bundy Sarah McGowan, here he comes. But no, I really don't see a good option for Prigozhin at this point.
Go ahead, Exit.
So I guess that gets to the point of if the MOD is somehow successful in trying to pull Wagner out of Africa in some way, is there anybody that can fill their void, either PMCs or actual MOD troops, and actually do an effective job like they have?
So I definitely think that there are people and organizations within MOD or GRU that could fill that void. But Russia is going to lose the benefit of plausible deniability. And it's not unlikely that they run into U.S. forces at some point, and having Wagner, take the blame for that type of thing, as they did in Syria, is beneficial for the MOD. They they would have to take a lot more caution around Gao, where, which is in Mali, where Manusa is based, and, where Barkhane was based previously. I think it causes a lot more of a headache for them, and it kind of illustrates why Wagner existed in the first place.
Okay, well, thanks for all that back and forth. It's great to have OPSEC available to chat, given his keen interest in Wagner and his years observing. And I have no doubt that it will come up again in the next couple of spaces as the continued fallout of the Wagner revolt, becomes more apparent. We get more insight into it. There are a few more points in connection with the revolt that I will run through quickly. Before I do that, I'll just as an administrative note, because the audience has grown a little bit and some of you may be new here, just a reminder that I hold these conversations every Thursday night starting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The first item up in the nest there is the invitation to our next space this coming Sunday at 4 p.m. So if you're enjoying the conversation, you can set your reminder. Set your reminder now. And for those who don't know, what we do here is we run through the news, and we'll use mainstream media sources, but then we augment those quite a bit using open source information, generally drawn from some of the terrific accounts here on Twitter. But then we also, work to share tools and techniques to bring everybody's skills up, and occasionally we highlight terrific projects done by OSINT analysts here on Twitter in an effort that we can highlight their work and potentially promote collaboration. And for those who don't know, I set an agenda for the conversations, and so most of these things that I speak to have sources that I share in the nest. If you were to click on that first item in the nest, the invite to the next conversation, that's embedded in the thread. If you look down through the thread, you can actually see all the sources that we've spoken to so far. As is often the case, we're not going to get near to finishing the contents. So I like to, toward the end of our conversation, speak to the fact that there's a lot more interesting news than we can get to in 3-4 hours. So I'd encourage you to peruse the thread a little bit, although I will highlight a handful of additional points before we wrap. Normally we run about 3 hours. We're at about 3.5. I might run another 10 or 15 minutes just to highlight a few cherry-picked items that I don't want to miss. And much of what we don't get to, I'll try and kick forward to our next conversation. The second item in the nest is just a reminder, again, for those who are new here, that friends of ours stream this conversation onto YouTube. And so while I encourage you to participate here so that you can join the conversation, which is only possible on Twitter, if you ever miss a conversation or there's a topic you want to go back to catch up on, you can always go to the YouTube account, and there are recordings of our live streams there. Okay, so we'll go to Aaron, and then I'll give you the last couple of points on the Wagner developments. Go ahead, Aaron.
I just want to say good night, everybody, and hopefully see everybody on Sunday. And then, and the Baumer reports after Michael's space on Sunday. Thanks a million.
Okay, so rather than breaking out the individual tweets, which is what I do toward the beginning as we get low on time, I'm just going to put up the blocks of info because it's a little bit faster to go through. So starting with the third item back in the nest, that's the tweet titled West. So these are the Western responses to what's happened with the Wagner revolt. So I'll just speak to the headlines of it. The first was an interesting claim that coming from a UK diplomat, there was a Russian flight going to Washington, D.C. The Americans noted that some Russian diplomats would be departing the United States. It didn't sound like they were being dismissed, but that their visas or their time here had come to an end. U.S. officials basically said, if you want numbers or why people are coming and going, you should speak to the Russians about that. And then this tweet I've included is a UK official saying they believe that flight not only was picking Russian diplomats up, but may actually have been bringing a number of Russian diplomats over. And they think it was a bit of a surge to help handle the diplomatic fallout from the revolt, just so there are more people to speak to American officials. The second item there is just a link to the U.S. Treasury statement on the new sanctions on Wagner that OPSEC referred to a moment ago. There's also the reports in newspaper outlets from the United Kingdom that Britain is apparently developing a political appetite to designate Wagner as a terrorist organization. It's not, as far as I know, it's not a done deal in the last day or so, but apparently the mood is indicating that's coming down the pipeline. And I guess finally on this point, there's also the fact we've talked about Wagner becoming more involved in Belarus and observations that a camp is being developed there. Rumors of up to 8,000 personnel, but none of, numbers approaching that definitely have not been confirmed yet. Despite that, there was a report put out by Bloomberg that Poland will be increasing its border security already out of concerns that there will be more Wagner personnel, which could lead to a more unstable situation in Belarus. So that was my roundup of Western responses. The fourth item back in the nest relates to, it's the tweet beginning with the phrase trolls. And so this is Wagner's influence operations, which of course are important as well. And so the first is that one of the primary businesses by which Prigozhin had been involved in influence operations is called the Internet Research Agency. And apparently it has been put up for sale. The reports that are coming out from, I think John, so this is the tweet from John Simpson. I believe he's a reporter in the United Kingdom who's pretty well connected. The word coming out is that one of the leading bidders to buy that, so that company that includes a troll network or influence network is the National Media Group, of which the chairperson is Alina Kabaeva, who is noted as a girlfriend or mistress of Vladimir Putin. So it seems like the Kremlin may be angling to take control of those influence networks. Some other elements of the Prigozhin networks appear to be going down. There was a report that the Ya Rus network had come out and announced its closure. In other parts of the world, there were reports from the All Eyes on Wagner account that troll farms in Mali appeared to have been back up and operating. So, the different influence networks around the world may have different results. And finally, in that tweet, there's a link. It's a tweet from Nadezhda, who, I occasionally will interact with, and noted that there was an academic article written in 2021 on Prigozhin's involvement in influence networks, said that wasn't the most up-to-date work on the issue. I've asked for more recent stuff, but if you want to look at some academic discussion of it, have a look there. Finally, on the Wagner front, the fifth tweet back in the nest is titled Analysis. And this is just some of the regular faces that we see doing good work. So included are the thoughts of Michael Kaufman, some comments from Rob Lee on the importance to Wagner of its senior commanders. There is a discussion of the implications on the Russian political scene from Tatiana Stanovaya, whose work we mention regularly. I did see in the replies to that a little bit of pushback, suggesting that Ms. Stanovaya's analysis maybe assumes too much as true that is yet unproven. So as with all sources, read and evaluate for yourself. And then finally, in the analysis was a quote coming from an article put out by Radio Free Europe that spoke with a former senior U.S. official who said that they believe that Prigozhin's days are numbered, which just goes back to a conversation that we were having earlier tonight. So those are the final materials on Wagner. I probably won't have time really to get into anything else. Maybe the one thing I'll put up just as a bit of a highlight of what else is available is just because of Twitter posting rules, you can put up a block of 25 tweets in one thread, after which you have to put them up individually now. So the last couple of sessions, because I often have 30 or so items I want to speak to, I'll put up a block of 25, then I'll do sort of a second half thread. If you were to look in the second half thread, it begins with a discussion of the developments in the Ukrainian offensive. As always, our space, we're not sort of breaking news on the front. And so we'll discuss interesting tactical implications. Unfortunately, we won't have time for that tonight. You can look at the material there. But what I do encourage people to look at is maps. And so what I've put in the front of the nest is my roundup of some of the best maps on the front line. So you can see what kind of the latest is. I've included there maps from militaryland.net, the Institute for the Study of War, Deep State, Project Owl, War Mapper, Poulet Volant, and our friend Andrew Perpetua, who occasionally comes to chat with us. On that front, as a final reminder, Andrew Perpetua will be holding his YouTube stream. I think he does them Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock Eastern time, and I believe he also holds them on Friday, so that they're possible for folks in Europe to follow before it's too late. I think it's Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern time, and I'm getting thumbs up from Exit, who will often appear to chat with Andrew on his streams. So if you want sort of a walkthrough of maps on YouTube, I would encourage you to have a look at Andrew Perpetua's profile, and you can follow his streams on YouTube. So probably discretion is a better part of value, and I will wrap up on that note. There's a lot to carry forward, but I guess I'll just have to do a better job at prioritizing topics so we can get deeper into it next time. But I thought we had some really great conversation tonight. And in particular, I'd like to thank OPSEC for joining us, because I know he has a specialties in covering Wagner, and he had lots of great insight for us tonight. So I would like to thank everybody for coming to listen to us, all of our speakers for contributing. I think that almost all of our speakers have been following the war in detail for a long time. I'd encourage you to check out their profiles and consider giving them a follow. And I'll say, I guess, finally, thank you to my co-hosts who sat for the extra time as well, to Riverside Kitty and to Jacoby. Without the help of my co-hosts and a handful of others who keep this project going, it would be very hard to continue. So I hope that you can all join us on Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. for our next conversation. And otherwise, have a good night.
Bye.